Annabelle Porter dropped to her knees in the dust and started stuffing her scattered clothes back into a broken trunk while 40 strangers watched her do it. Her wedding dress, her mother's wedding dress, lay trampled under a stranger's boot, and the man who'd sent for her was already walking away. "I don't want her," Gerald Harrington had said loud enough for the whole platform to hear. "Send her back." And Annabelle, on her hands and knees in front of the entire town of Silver Creek, understood she had crossed 1,000 miles to be thrown away. Before we go on, if this story pulls at your heart, take a moment to subscribe and follow all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what town are you watching from tonight? I love to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The trunk latch had snapped somewhere between Denver and here, and Annabelle Porter hadn't known it until the porter set it down too hard, and the whole thing sprang open like a dropped hymnal, spilling 3 years of careful saving across the platform boards. Petticoats, a tin of hairpins, her father's Bible, the blue dress she'd meant to be married in. She went down after it without thinking, the way a mother goes after a falling child, and that was the position she was in, knees in the grit, hands full of trampled cloth, when Gerald Harrington finally looked at her. He did not offer to help her up. "You Miss Porter," he said. "I am." She got the words out steady, though her heart was slamming. She rose the rest of the way herself, one hand pressed flat against the trunk lid to keep it from gaping open again, the other still gripping a fistful of the blue dress. "Mr. Harrington, I wrote to you. I've been writing to you for 6 months. I know who you are." He was not the man from the letters. That was the first thing that broke in her quiet and complete, before he ever said another word. The letters had spoken of a strong man in the prime of his years, 40 acres, and a good house, and a lonesomeness that a good woman might mend. The man in front of her was closer to 60, thin through the chest, with a mouth pulled down at both corners, like it had never once in its life said something kind. He held his hat in both hands, but not out of courtesy. He held it the way a man holds a thing he is about to use as an excuse to leave. "There's been a change," Gerald said. Annabelle stood very still. Behind him, the town of Silver Creek had begun to gather, the way towns do when they smell a spectacle. Women paused with their market baskets. 2 men leaned against the freight office wall and folded their arms. A boy of maybe 9 stood at the edge of the platform with his mouth open. Annabelle felt every one of those eyes settle on her dust-streaked skirt, on the broken trunk, on the fistful of wedding blue in her hand. "A change," she repeated. "My sister's come to live with me." Gerald said it fast, like a man crossing a cold creek. "Winter before last her husband passed, and she's got no place, and it's her right she's blood, and a house can't run with 2 women in it, everybody knows that. So," he turned the hat once in his hands, "I won't be needing a wife." For a moment, Annabelle could not make the words go anywhere. They sat in her ears without meaning the way a foreign language does. "You won't be needing a wife," she said. "That's right. Mr. Harrington?" She took one step toward him and heard the whole platform go quiet to listen. "I sold my father's watch to pay for this passage. I sold his books. I sold the bed I was born in. I have $4 and a broken trunk, and I have come 1,040 miles because you wrote to me that you were a lonesome man of good character looking for a helpmeet." Her voice did not rise. It was worse than rising. It went flat and clear and carrying. "You wrote that. In your own hand. Circumstances change." "For you," she said. "Circumstances changed for you." Gerald's face closed like a door. He reached into his coat and came out with a folded paper, and even before he held it out to her, she knew what it was, and her stomach dropped clean out of her. "Bought you a ticket back east," he said. "Leaves Thursday. That's more than I had to do. A lot of men wouldn't have done that much." He held the ticket out into the space between them, and Annabelle Porter, who had been raised in a good house in Boston, who had poured tea for the wives of shipping men, who had never in 26 years of life been spoken to like a stray dog on a road. Annabelle looked at that ticket, and looked at the trampled dress in her own 2 hands, and understood with a terrible cold clarity exactly what she was in the eyes of this town. She was a thing that had been ordered and returned. "I don't want your ticket," she said. "Now don't be foolish. I said I don't want it." A woman in the crowd laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was amused, the laugh of a person watching something that had nothing to do with them. It carried across the platform, and Annabelle felt it land on the back of her neck like a splash of cold water, and something in her chest that had been holding on very hard for 1,040 miles finally began quietly to let go. "Take the ticket, girl," said one of the men by the freight office. "Ain't got the sense God gave a goose," said the other. "Poor thing come all this way," said a woman, not to Annabelle, to the woman beside her. "You'd think they'd send a likeness first, so he'd know what he was getting." "He knew what he was getting," said her friend. "A mail order woman. That's what he was getting." The word went around the platform like a coin passed hand to hand. Mail order. Annabelle heard it, and heard it, and heard it, and each time it was a little smaller and a little dirtier, until it did not sound like a way to find a husband at all. It sounded like something you scraped off your boot. "Gerald." A new voice, an older woman pushing to the front with the confidence of a person nobody argued with. "You send her back and be done with it. We don't need her sort loitering around Silver Creek putting ideas in the men's heads." "I aim to," Gerald said. "Her sort," Annabelle said. She did not know where the voice came from. It came up out of somewhere below her fear, from a place she'd never had cause to visit before. "I answered an honest advertisement in an honest paper," she said. And now finally her voice did rise, and it rang off the freight office wall and the water tower and the flat Colorado sky. "I answered it with references. From a minister. From the wife of a shipping merchant. I did not steal, I did not lie. I did not present myself as anything but what I am, which is a woman with no family left, and no fortune left, and nothing in this world but her own 2 hands, and her own good name. And I have crossed half a country to be called a sort, by strangers who have known me for the length of one train's arrival." Silence. Even the amused woman had stopped smiling. "I would rather sleep in that ditch," Annabelle said, and she pointed with the trampled blue dress, actually pointed at the drainage ditch beyond the platform. "Then take one more thing from the hand of a man who wrote me a letter promising decency and met me with a train ticket out of town. So you may keep it, Mr. Harrington. You may keep your ticket and your 40 acres and your sister and your good character, and I hope they keep you warm." She turned back to her trunk. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely close the lid. She pressed down on it with the flat of her palm, and it wouldn't catch the snapped latch, just skidding off, and she pressed again, and it skidded again, and she thought, "If I cannot even close this trunk in front of them, I will die. I will simply die of it right here." And she pressed a third time, and her breath came out ragged, and the whole platform watched her fail to close a broken trunk. "Miss?" The voice came from behind her, and it was so different from every voice that had come before it that she went still without turning around. It was low, it was unhurried, and it had underneath it a kind of stillness that made the whole crowd shift on its feet. "That latch is bent," the voice said. "You push it straight down, it'll never catch. Got to lift the lid a hair and set it in sideways." Annabelle turned. The man had come up so quietly she hadn't heard him, a big man broad through the shoulders in a dark coat gone pale at the seams with hard use. He wasn't young. There was gray coming in at his temples and a seam of an old scar running down under his jaw into his collar. He held his hat in one hand, and he was looking at her, only at her, as though the entire staring crowd had simply ceased to exist. He crouched down beside her trunk without being asked. "May I?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Annabelle didn't answer. She couldn't. He took her not answering as leave enough, lifted the lid a fraction, tilted the broken latch, and set it home with a soft, final click. Then he stood, and he was very tall, and he turned to face the platform, and Annabelle watched the whole crowd take one small step back. "Kieran," said the older woman, who'd wanted her gone, and there was something new in her voice now. Caution. "This isn't your business. Reckon I'll decide what's my business, Mrs. Thorne." He said it mild. He said it almost gentle. But the platform had gone silent as a church, and Annabelle understood watching that she had crossed paths with a man the whole town was afraid of. Harrington. Kieran Knox turned that mild, unhurried attention on Gerald, and Gerald's throat moved. You wrote this woman letters. That's a private matter. You wrote her letters. Kieran said, promising a home. She sold what she had. She got on a train. She came 1,000 miles on the strength of your word as a man. He paused. The pause did more than any shout could have. And you met her with a way to get rid of her. My sister. Your sister came in the spring. Kieran's voice never lifted, and somehow, that was the worst of it, the way it stayed so level while the ground under Gerald visibly gave way. You knew about your sister in the spring, Gerald. You wrote this woman a letter in May. I know because Ada down at the post office weighs the mail, and she remembers your hand, and she remembers you posting east all through the summer. You knew you had no room for a wife, and you wrote her anyway, and you let her spend the last of what she had, and you dragged her out here in front of the whole town, so you wouldn't have to say no on paper where a man could hold it against you. Nobody moved. Gerald had gone the color of tallow. Now that, Kieran said, is the lowest thing I have watched a man do in this town, and I have watched a man shoot another man's dog. A sound went through the crowd. Not laughter. Something else. Shame may be catching. You calling me a liar, Knox? Gerald tried to draw himself up. It didn't take. I'm calling you a coward, Kieran said. There's a difference. A liar might have had the nerve to lie to her face. You couldn't even manage that. You made her cross the whole country so you could hand her a ticket and let the town do the rest of the work of shaming her. He tipped his head just slightly toward the crowd, and half of them dropped their eyes. And you all did it. Every one of you standing here laughing at a woman on her knees in the dirt. I heard you. Mrs. Thorne, I heard you real clear. Mrs. Thorne's chin came up. Somebody has to think of the towns what Kieran said. It's good name, it's Christian character. You want to talk to me about Christian character. He looked slowly down the platform from face to face, and one by one the faces turned away. There's not a person on this platform who came to more harm today than that woman right there, and every single one of you found the time to laugh at her for it. That's the town's good name. That's what you're protecting. And then he turned back to Annabelle. The change in him was the thing she never forgot, not in all the years after. The hard flatness he'd turned on the crowd folded away, and what looked at her instead was careful, almost uncertain, as though this part, the part where he spoke to her directly, was the part he was less sure how to do. Miss, he said, I don't know your name. Porter, she managed. Annabelle Porter. Miss Porter. He turned his hat once in his hands, and she recognized the gesture. It was the same one Gerald had made, but on Kieran Knox it meant something entirely different. It meant a man reaching for words he didn't often have call to use. I got a ranch north of here, the Barquet. It's a working outfit, 40 men in the season, and the house that ought to run it hasn't been run proper since my mother died 6 years back. It's a mess. I won't lie to you about that. It's a mess, and it's hard country, and the winters are worse than anything you saw in Boston. Annabelle stared at him. I'm not offering you what he offered you. Kieran said it plain, and she saw two of the women behind him exchange a glance. I'm not offering marriage. I don't know you, and you don't know me, and I'll not stand here and make a stranger a promise the way he did. But I'll offer you honest work. Housekeeper. 3 months' room and board and a fair wage, and at the end of it, if you want to go, I'll buy your ticket to anywhere on the line, and you'll owe me not one thing. And if you want to stay on as housekeeper, that's a standing position, and yours as long as you do the work. He paused. That's all it is. Work. A woman ought to be able to earn her keep without having to marry the first man who'll have her. Or the second. Somewhere in the crowd, someone drew a sharp breath. Kieran Knox, said Mrs. Thorne, you cannot mean to install an unmarried woman in your house. Sarah Beckett will be there, Kieran said, not turning around. My cook. Been with the family 30 years. She'll chaperone the propriety of it to your full satisfaction, Mrs. Thorne. And if it isn't to your satisfaction, you can come up to the bar K and take it up with Sarah, who I promise will have opinions." He kept his eyes on Annabelle. "Miss Porter, I know how this looks. Strange man, strange offer, and you've had a hard morning of it. You don't have to say yes, but you don't have to get on that train either, and you don't have to sleep in any ditch, and whatever else, you don't ever have to take one thing from that man's hand again." Annabelle looked at him. She looked at the scar under his jaw, and the gray at his temples, and the coat gone pale at the seams, and the hat he kept turning in his hands. She looked at Gerald Harrington still holding his rejected ticket, small and gray and eager now to be gone. She looked at the crowd that had laughed at her, and at the boy of 9 with his mouth still open, and at the blue dress she was still, she realized, gripping in one fist. Every sensible thing her mother had ever taught her said no. You did not go off with a strange man to a ranch full of 40 rough men on the strength of one act of decency on a train platform. You did not. It was the exact kind of foolishness that ended women. But her mother had also taught her to read a face, and Annabelle had spent 1,040 miles learning that letters could lie, and men could lie, and papers could lie. And the only thing that had told her the truth all day was the flat, cold way this man had said, "I have watched a man shoot another man's dog," and the careful, uncertain way he'd said, "I don't know your name." "Mr. Knox," she said. "Why?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Why'd I stop?" he said. "You don't know me. You said it yourself. You gain nothing. That man is nothing to me, and I'm nothing to you, and you could have walked past this whole thing and lost your afternoon to worrying and been home by dark." She searched his face. "So why?" For a long moment, Kieran Knox didn't answer. The crowd had gone still again, and this time it was a different kind of still, the kind where people are listening for something true. "My mother came out here the same way you did," he said finally. The platform went so quiet, Annabelle could hear the wind in the water tower. Not the same man, not the same year. But she answered an advertisement and got on a train and came west to a stranger same as you. And the man she came to. Kieran's jaw worked once. "Well, he wasn't a good man, and there wasn't anybody on the platform to say a word for her when she got here and found out what she'd married. She told me about it once near the end. Told me how she stood there realizing what she'd done, and looked around at all those faces, and not one of them would meet her eye. Not one." He looked at Annabelle. "I was 13 years too late to be on that platform for her, Miss Porter. So I reckon I've got a standing debt to any woman who ends up on one. That's all. That's the whole of it." Annabelle Porter felt her eyes fill, and she was furious at them for it. Furious to weep now in front of these people after she'd held so hard for so long. But she blinked it back, and she lifted her chin, and she made her decision the way she had learned that morning, to make decisions which was fast and clear, and without one backward glance at the people watching. 3 months, she said. 3 months. Honest work, a fair wage, Mrs. Beckett in the house. You have my word, and I keep my own money, and my own leave to go, and no man tells me otherwise. Something moved across Kieran Knox's face, not a smile. He didn't seem like a man who smiled easy, but something in the neighborhood of one. No man tells you otherwise, he said. I'll write it down if you like. Put my name to it. You've had enough of men's words that didn't hold. I'll want it written, Annabelle said. After this morning, I'll want it written. Then it'll be written. He bent and picked up her mended trunk as if it weighed nothing, hitched it up onto one shoulder, and stood waiting. And Annabelle Porter, with the whole town of Silver Creek watching, tucked her mother's trampled blue wedding dress under her arm, and walked off that platform beside a man she had known for the length of a single humiliation. They did not speak until the town was behind them. He'd handed her up onto the wagon seat with a courtesy so plain and undramatic that it undid something in her. No flourish, no lingering, just a steady hand under her elbow, and then gone. He climbed up the other side, took the reins, clucked to the team, and they rolled out past the last building of Silver Creek and onto the North Road with the sun already tipping west. You'll be wanting to know about the place, he said after a while. I'll be wanting to know about you. Annabelle said. "The place I'll see when we get there." He glanced at her sideways. "Fair. How many is 40 men?" 40 in season. Fewer now. Come branding we take on more. Come winter we're down to a dozen that hold over." He kept his eyes on the team. "They won't trouble you. I'll see to that the first night, and it won't need seeing to twice." "You say that easy." "I mean it easy." Annabelle looked at him. "The town's afraid of you," she said. "I felt it. Mrs. Thorne's a woman who's used to being obeyed, and she stepped back from you like you were a hot stove. Why?" Kieran was quiet a moment. "You always this direct?" "I used to be softer," Annabelle said. "I find I've run clean out of the time it takes to be soft, so yes." "Why is the town afraid of you, Mr. Knox, and should I be?" "No," he said. "You shouldn't, and I'll tell you why they are since you asked it straight." He shifted the reins to one hand. "When I came home from the war, I came home to find the man who'd been running cattle through this valley had taken half my father's land while I was gone, and my father too sick to fight it. Fellow named Colton. Had paper that said it was his forged paper, and a dozen men to back it, and the law in this county was his cousin. So there wasn't any law. There was just him and me." He said it flat the way he'd said everything hard all day. "It took me 2 years to get that land back. Some of it took paper. Some of it didn't. By the time it was done, Colton was gone, and I was the biggest outfit in the valley, and every man in Silver Creek had made up his mind he'd sooner be my friend than my enemy. That's the whole story. They're not afraid I'll hurt them. They're afraid because they watched me not lose. People are always afraid of a man who doesn't lose. They can't figure the price he paid, so they fear the paying." "And the price you paid," Annabelle said. He looked at her again longer this time. "You don't ask small questions, do you?" "Not anymore. The price I paid," Kieran said, and turned back to the road, "is my own to carry. But I'll tell you this much, since we're to share a roof 3 months. I don't drink to excess. I don't raise my hand to anyone who works for me, and I have never in my life spoken to a woman the way that town spoke to you today. And I never will. You can put the rest of your worrying down. Whatever I am, and I'm not a soft man, I won't pretend to you I am. I'm not that." Annabelle Porter sat with that as the wagon rolled north, and found to her own surprise that she believed him. "My father died in March," she said. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out of her the way the trunk had sprung open all at once without permission. "He was a decent man, a shipping clerk. Not rich, but decent and careful. And he raised me alone after my mother passed, and he never once made me feel it was a burden. And then a firm he'd invested his whole life savings in, a firm run by men in fine coats who dined at fine tables. That firm failed, and it turned out they'd known it would fail for a year and had gone right on taking men's savings anyhow. And my father, who never harmed a soul, lost everything, and the shame of it stopped his heart in the night. 61 years old. I found him at his desk in the morning with the letters from those men still in his hand." She was gripping the blue dress in her lap without knowing it. "So when you ask me why I answered an advertisement from a stranger 1,000 miles away, that's why. Because the men in fine coats at fine tables were the ones who killed my father. And I decided I would rather take my chances with a stranger in the honest West than one more day among people who wore decency like a coat and had none of it underneath." The wagon rolled on. Kieran Knox didn't say anything for a long moment, and she was glad of it, because she thought if he offered her comfort now, she might break entirely. He didn't offer comfort. "Those men," he said instead, "the ones in the fine coats, they still walking around Boston?" "I imagine so. Free as air. Free as air." Kieran nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd long suspected about the world. "That's the thing about back east," he said. "Out here a man does what those men did, he answers for it. Might not answer to the law. Law's a slow business and doesn't always come. But he answers. The valley remembers. Out here, your name is the only thing you've got that a bank can't take, and a man who spends it does it once." He clucked to the team. Your father was a decent man in a place that didn't reward it. I'm sorry for that, Miss Porter. That's a hard thing to watch. You didn't watch it. No, but I've watched its like. A decent man broken by men who'll never answer for the breaking. I've watched that plenty. His hands were easy on the reins, but his voice had gone somewhere far off. It's the thing I hate most in this world, if you want to know. More than rustlers, more than Colton, more than any man who ever came at me with a gun. Men who do harm from behind a fine table and a fine word, and never once put their own skin near the fire. Rustlers I can meet. Them I can meet on ground, where it costs us both the same. But the men in the fine coats, they've arranged it, so it never costs them anything at all. That's the true wickedness. Arranging it so it's always somebody else who pays. Annabelle turned and looked at him full in the face for the first time since the platform. You are a strange man, Kieran Knox, she said. I've been told. I mean that you talk like a man who's thought a great deal about wickedness. I have, he said simply. A man who's done hard things is obliged to think about it, or he becomes one of the things he's had to fight. I decided a long while back I'd rather think too much than turn into Colton. It's a near thing some days, but I'd rather. They came up over a low rise then, and the barquet spread out below them in the last of the afternoon light. A long, low house with a wide porch. Barns and corrals and bunkhouses laid out beyond it. Cattle scattered dark across the grass to the horizon. A windmill turning slow against the sky. It was bigger than anything Annabelle had pictured. It was bigger than her whole street in Boston. That's it, Kieran said. That's the barquet. It's enormous. It's a lot to keep. That's why I need a housekeeper and not a bride. He said it dry, and she almost laughed and was startled that she almost laughed after the day she'd had. House is the one that's fallen apart. You'll see. The land I keep. The house I never learned how to. A woman had come out onto the porch as the wagon rolled in, heavy-set, gray-haired, an apron over a gray dress, one hand shading her eyes. She watched the wagon come with the frank, unhurried assessment of a woman who had seen everything and been impressed by very little of it. Sarah, Kieran called, drawing up. This is Miss Annabelle Porter. She'll be keeping house for us 3 months and maybe longer if she takes to it and we don't drive her off. Miss Porter, this is Sarah Beckett. She raised me more or less after my mother passed, and she'll tell you I didn't take. Everything she says about me is true, and you should believe all of it. Sarah Beckett came down the porch steps and stood at the wagon and looked up at Annabelle for a long, long moment. You're the one from the station, she said. News come up ahead of you. Josiah rode up not an hour ago full of it. Said Kieran Knox emptied out his mouth at half the town over a mail-order gal that got left standing. Her eyes moved over Annabelle's dust-streaked skirt, the broken trunk, the blue dress in her lap. Then, unexpectedly, they softened. That true, child. They leave you standing. Annabelle's throat closed. She managed a nod. Sarah Beckett's mouth set into a hard line, but the hardness wasn't for her. Annabelle understood. It was for the town. Gerald Harrington. I knew his mother. She'd have taken a switch to him. She reached up a broad, work-worn hand. Well, come down off there, child, before you fall down off there. You look like you've been through a war and lost. Come down and I'll put coffee in you, and you can tell me the whole of it, and Kieran can go see to his horses, which he'd rather do than stand here listening to women anyhow. I would, Kieran agreed, already swinging down. And that was how Annabelle Porter came to the barquet. She learned the shape of it in pieces over those first hours, sitting at the long kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, while Sarah Beckett moved around the room and drew the story out of her a little at a time, gentle and relentless as water. She learned that the house had 11 rooms, and that 7 of them had been shut up since the elder Mrs. Knox passed sheets thrown over the furniture dust an inch thick. She learned that Kieran took his supper in the kitchen with the men most nights and hadn't sat in the dining room in years. She learned that there had been a wife once. No, not a wife. Sarah went quiet at a certain point, and Annabelle understood there was a story there and did not press it, because she of all people knew what it was to have a story you didn't press. He tell you why he stopped for you? Sarah asked near dark, setting a plate down in front of Annabelle without asking whether she wanted it. He said his mother came out the same way I did, and there wasn't anyone on the platform to speak for her. Sarah stood very still with the dish rag in her hand. He told you that, she said. He did. Then you should know something, child, and I'll tell it to you plain, because you've had a belly full of men who wouldn't tell you things plain. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, heavy and deliberate. Kieran Knox does not talk about his mother. Not to me, and I was here. Not to the preacher. Not to anybody in 6 years. I have watched that man face down armed men without changing his breathing, and I have never once heard him say her name out loud in this house since the day we buried her. She folded her hands on the table. So whatever it is you did on that platform today, however you looked, or whatever you said, or whatever it was he saw in you, it got him to open a door he keeps nailed shut. I don't know you from Eve, but I've known him 30 years, and I'm telling you that don't happen. That doesn't happen. Annabelle looked down at the plate she couldn't eat from. I didn't do anything, she said. I was on my knees in the dirt, trying to close a broken trunk. Sarah said again. Maybe that was the doing. Later, much later, after Sarah had shown her to a small clean room off the kitchen that had been made up fresh after she'd washed the dust of 1,000 miles off her face in a basin of warm water. After she'd hung her mother's ruined blue dress on a peg on the wall where she could see it. Annabelle Porter lay awake in a strange bed under a strange roof and listened to the enormous quiet of the Colorado night. She thought about the men in the fine coats in Boston, free as air. She thought about Gerald Harrington and his rejected ticket and his sister and his 40 acres. She thought about the whole town laughing at a woman on her knees. And then she thought about a big man with a scar under his jaw crouching down beside her broken trunk without being asked, setting the bent latch home with a soft final click and standing up to turn the whole weight of himself between her and the crowd. That latch is bent. You push it straight down, it'll never catch. She thought about how he hadn't touched her once, except to hand her up onto the wagon seat steady and gone. She thought about, I was 13 years too late to be on that platform for her, so I reckon I've got a standing debt. She did not trust it. She had learned that very morning not to trust the kindness of men she didn't know, and one afternoon of decency did not unlearn it. She lay in the dark and told herself, 3 months. Honest work. Take the wage and keep your own counsel, and be ready to leave the moment it turns, because it always turns, and a woman who forgets that is a woman who ends up on her knees on a train platform learning it all over again. But underneath the not trusting in a place she couldn't quite reach to shut off, something else had begun. Small. Quiet. Barely anything at all. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that Annabelle Porter had gone to sleep somewhere she was not afraid. In the morning, she was up before the light, because that was how her father had raised her, and no amount of grief had unraveled it. She found the kitchen already warm. Sarah Beckett. It turned out rose earlier than anyone alive, and she rolled up her sleeves and asked what needed doing. And Sarah looked at her, rolled up sleeves for a moment, with something like approval, and put her to work. By the time Kieran Knox came in for his coffee an hour after sunup dust on his boots and his hat in his hand, the kitchen was scrubbed to the corners and there was fresh bread rising under a cloth. And Annabelle Porter had swept 6 years of neglect out of the front hall and had the windows of the shut-up parlor thrown open for the first time since his mother died. He stopped in the doorway of that parlor and looked at the open windows and the light coming into the dead room, and he didn't say anything for a moment. And Annabelle, watching him from the top of a stepladder with a rag in her hand, saw something cross his face that she couldn't name. Something that hurt him and helped him at the same time. You didn't have to open those, he said finally. His voice wasn't quite level, and she pretended not to notice, because she understood pretending not to notice. The whole room was holding its breath, Mr. Knox, she said, going back to the window she was cleaning. Rooms shouldn't hold their breath. It isn't good for them. Now, if you'll tell me where your mother kept the linens, I'll have the rest of these rooms breathing by week's end, and then this house will be a house again, instead of a museum to a woman who I'm sure would rather it was lived in. Kieran Knox stood in the doorway a moment longer. Bottom of the stairs, he said. Cedar chest, keys on the ring by the door. And then quieter as he turned to go. She would have. Liked you, I mean. My mother. She'd have liked you fine. He was gone before she could answer, his boots loud on the boards, and then out the door, and Annabelle Porter stood on the stepladder in the flooding morning light with a rag in her hand, and her heart doing something complicated and unwelcome in her chest, and she told it firmly to stop. It didn't stop. She got down off the ladder and went to find the cedar chest, because there was work to do, and work was the one thing in all the world she still knew how to trust. And outside the open window, the enormous morning was coming up gold over the parquet, and somewhere out on the grass, a man who did not lose was riding out to keep the land that was the only thing he had left that a bank couldn't take. And Annabelle Porter, who had come west to be a bride and been thrown away like a returned parcel before noon, set her hand to the key on the ring by the door and began, without quite meaning to build herself a life in the ruins of the one she'd lost. She did not know yet what the valley knew, that trouble was already riding toward the parquet from the far side of the hills, that the men who took cattle in the dark had marked Kieran Knox's herd, that before the summer was out, she would learn what it cost to belong to a place worth fighting for. She only knew the weight of the key in her hand, and the light in the dead room, and the strange, unwelcome, undeniable fact that for the first time since she'd found her father at his desk with the letters in his hand, she had woken somewhere that felt, against all sense and all caution, like it might one day be worth the name of home. She turned the key in the cedar chest and lifted the lid, and the smell of cedar and old linen and a dead woman's careful keeping rose up to meet her, and Annabelle Porter got to work. The cedar chest gave up its secrets one folded thing at a time, and each one was a small blow. Sheets pressed and stacked by hands 6 years dead. A christening gown yellowed at the hem. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue gone brittle, a woman's shawl of gray wool with a note pinned to it in a careful, slanting hand. Annabelle unpinned the note before she could think better of it. "For whoever comes after me to this house," it read, "there is more than one way to be a mother. Keep it warm." She sat back on her heels with the shawl in her lap and did not hear Sarah Beckett come up behind her until the older woman spoke. "She wrote that the winter before she passed," Sarah said. "Made me promise I'd give it to the next woman who kept this house proper. I never did. Wasn't a next woman worth the giving." She looked down at Annabelle a long moment. "Reckon there is now." "I've been here one day, Mrs. Beckett." "You've been here one day, and this hall hasn't seen the sun in 6 years, Sarah said. "Put the shawl on, child. She'd want it working, not folded. That woman never folded a useful thing in her life if she could help it." Annabelle put the shawl on. By week's end, she had 4 of the 7 dead rooms breathing again, and the men were beginning to notice. She heard them before she understood them, a difference in the bunkhouse noise at supper, a way the talk dropped when she crossed the yard. On the 4th evening, a young hand named Tom Avery took his hat clean off his head when she passed with a basket of wash, and stood there holding it against his chest like she was Sunday, and said, "Ma'am," in a voice that cracked in the middle, and went red to his ears when the other men laughed. "You leave her be," Sarah snapped from the porch. "First man that troubles that girl answers to Kieran, and then answers to me, and I'm the worse of the two." "Wasn't troubling her, Miss Sarah," Tom protested. "Was being polite." "He was being polite," said an older hand dry as dust. "Boys forgot what a swept floor looks like. Thinks he's died and gone somewhere nicer." But it was true. The ranch had changed, and every man on it could feel it, and none of them could quite say why a woman scrubbing floors should make 40 hard men stand up straighter, except that it did. The house had a smell of bread again. The lamps were trimmed. Somebody had put wildflowers in a jar on the long kitchen table, and no man would admit to caring about wildflowers in a jar, and every one of them looked at them. Kieran Knox said nothing about any of it for 6 days. On the 7th he came in past dark later than usual, and Annabelle heard the difference in his boots on the porch before she saw his face heavier, slower, and when he came into the lamplight, she saw that his knuckles were split, and one sleeve was torn at the shoulder, and there was blood dried brown along his jaw over the old scar. She set down the plate she was holding. "Sit down," she said. "It's nothing. Mr. Knox, there is dried blood on your face, and your hand is bleeding on my clean floor. Sit down." He looked at her. Then, to her surprise, he sat. She got the basin and the clean rag and the good soap before she let herself think about the fact that she'd never touched him, that a week ago she hadn't known his name, that she was about to put her hands on a man the whole town was afraid of because he'd walked in bleeding and she couldn't seem to do anything else. She wrung the rag and stood over him and tipped his chin up with 2 fingers the way she'd have done for her father. And Kieran Knox went very still under her hand, stiller than she'd have thought a man that size could go. "Hold still," she said. "I am holding still." "You're holding still like a fence post. There's a difference." She wiped the blood from the old scar, careful, and felt him not flinch, which was worse than flinching. What happened? Difference of opinion. With whom? 2 men, Kieran said, who thought the North Line was theirs to run cattle across. It isn't. We had a discussion about it. A discussion. They've a firmer grasp on the property lines now. Annabelle rinsed the rag and wrung it out, and it came away pink into the basin, and she looked at that pink water and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the well. "Rustlers," she said. Kieran's eyes came up to hers. "Who told you that word?" "Nobody. I'm not a child, Mr. Knox, and I've got 2 ears. The men talk when they think I'm not by, and they're bad at knowing when I'm by, and the word they use is rustlers, and they use it the way people use words they're scared of." She pressed the rag to his split knuckles harder than she strictly needed to, and he let her. "How bad?" "It's not your worry. You bled on my floor. You made it my worry when you bled on my floor." She held his hand in both of hers and looked at him steady. "How bad?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then something in him seemed to decide she'd earned it, or that lying to her was more trouble than the truth. "Bad and getting worse," he said. "Somebody's been taking my cattle off the North Range in the dark. Small at first, 10 head, then 30. 2 nights ago it was near 60, and whoever's doing it knows my range better than a stranger ought to, and moves faster than a small outfit could, and hasn't left me one track I can follow past the creek." He turned his split hand over in hers absently, the way a man turns a thing he's studying. "That's not 2 saddle tramps helping themselves, Miss Porter. That's an operation. Somebody with men and money to move stolen beef, and a reason to come at me in particular." "A reason." "There's always a reason." His voice went flat and far off the way it had on the wagon. "A man doesn't build the biggest outfit in the valley without building a list of folks who'd like to see it burn. I've been on top 10 years. Somebody's decided it's my turn to come down." "Who?" "That," Kieran said, "is the question I've been asking the creek and the tracks and 2 men's split lips all week, and none of them will tell me." Annabelle tied off the last strip of rag around his knuckles and stepped back and looked at her work and then at his face, and she asked the thing she hadn't meant to ask. "Are you going to be all right?" Kieran Knox looked up at her from the kitchen chair. Blood cleaned off his jaw. Now, his bandaged hand resting on the scrubbed table, and something moved across his hard face that she had not seen there before. Surprise, plain and simple, as if the question itself was a thing nobody had asked him in a very long while. "You're asking me that," he said. "I'm asking you that." "Why?" "Because you asked me the same thing on a train platform," Annabelle said in your own way when you didn't have to, and I find I've caught it off you. It's a hard habit to keep clean of, apparently. Are you going to be all right, Mr. Knox?" He held her eyes a beat too long. "I don't rightly know," he said, and it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since Boston. The rustling got worse before it got better, and it did not get better. Annabelle learned the rhythm of dread on a working ranch. How the men would come in at dawn with a count that was wrong, and you'd know it by their faces, before they said a word. How Kieran would go out at all hours and come back grimmer. How a whole outfit could hold its breath, waiting for a strike. It couldn't predict or prevent. She learned to read the yard the way she'd learned to read a face. She learned that fear had a smell, and it smelled like too much coffee drunk too fast in a bunkhouse at 3 in the morning. And through all of it, she and Kieran Knox talked. It happened by accident the first few times, then not by accident. He fell into the habit of coming into the kitchen after the men had gone to their bunks when the house was quiet and the fire was low, and finding her there, she'd taken to doing her mending by the last of the firelight, because she couldn't sleep either, and he'd pour himself the dregs of the coffee and sit down across the long table, and they'd talk in the low, easy voices of people who have decided without ever saying so that the dark hours belong to them. "Tell me about Boston," he said one night. "You don't want to hear about Boston. It's all fine coats and fine tables. You'd hate it." "That's why I want to hear it. Man ought to know the shape of the thing he hates." So she told him. She told him about the drawing rooms and the calling cards and the exact and terrible arithmetic of who bowed to whom. She told him about her father's employer, who had wept real tears at the funeral and then sent a bill for the funeral flowers. She told him about the men in the fine coats, Prentice. The name was Prentice. And Hale, who'd taken her father's savings, knowing the firm was rotten, and who'd stood at the graveside in black gloves, and who had, the last she heard, opened a new office on a better street. Kieran listened to all of it without moving. "Prentice and Hale," he said when she was done. "Why do you say it like that?" "Because you said it like that. You've been carrying those two names around like stones in your apron for 4 months, and you'll carry them another 40 years if somebody doesn't take them off you." He turned his coffee cup a slow half-turn on the table. "Doesn't help you know. Carrying them. I've carried a few. Colton, a couple others. It doesn't do to them one thing you'd want it to do, only weighs you." "Then why do you still carry Colton?" The question landed harder than she'd meant it to. Kieran went still. "Because I haven't figured out how to set him down," he said finally. "Not because it's wise to carry him. Because I don't yet know how to stop. That's not an argument for doing it, Miss Porter. That's a confession that I'm no better at it than you are." He looked up at her. "I just started earlier." They sat with that a while, the fire ticking. "You never told me about the war," Annabelle said. "No, Sarah said you don't." "Sarah's right." "All right." She went back to her mending. She'd learned that with him, that you could open a door part way and then had to let it swing on its own, that pushing it closed it, that the only way through Kieran Knox was to stand in the doorway and wait and let him decide. She threaded her needle and said nothing more about the war, and it was the not pushing that did it. Because after a long while into the low fire, he began to talk. "I was 19, he said. "You want to know the truth of it, that's the truth of it. I was 19 years old, and I thought I knew what a hard thing was because I'd broke horses and buried my father's dogs. Then I found out." He didn't look at her. He looked at the fire. "I'm not going to tell you the war, Miss Porter. Not because you couldn't hear it, because I've watched what it does to a person to have it in them, and I'll be damned if I'll be the one puts it in you. Some things a man carries so nobody else has to. That one I'll carry." He was quiet a moment. "But I'll tell you the thing it taught me, since you keep asking me true questions, and I keep meaning to lie and finding I can't. It taught me that decent men die in the mud, and cruel men walk home whistling, and there is not 1 ounce of justice arranged into the machinery of this world. Not 1 ounce. Whatever justice there is, somebody has to make. By hand, every time. Or it doesn't get made." Annabelle set down her mending. "That's why you stopped on the platform," she said slowly. "Not just your mother. That's the whole of it, isn't it? You saw an injustice arranged and no one making it right, so you made it right. By hand." Kieran looked at her, then full on across the low firelight. And there was something in his face she'd never seen on any man's. Not want, not the crude thing she'd braced for since Boston. But recognition, the look of a person who has been alone with a thought his whole life, and just heard it come out of somebody else's mouth. "Nobody's ever said it back to me before," he said quietly. "In 10 years. Nobody's ever once said it back." "Well?" Annabelle picked her mending back up because her hands needed something to do. "I've run clean out of the time it takes to leave true things unsaid. I told you that on the wagon." "You did." A ghost of that not-quite smile. "I'm beginning to think it might be the best thing about you, Miss Porter, and there's a good deal to choose from." She kept her eyes on her needle and did not let him see what that did to her, and she was almost sure she managed it, and she was wrong because Kieran Knox saw most things. The strike came 10 nights later, and it came harder than any before it. She woke to the sound of running horses and men shouting, and a red light bleeding through her window that should not have been there in the dead middle of the night. And she was out of bed and into her dress with her heart going like a drum before she'd finished waking. And when she got the kitchen door open, the whole eastern sky was orange. Barns afire. That was Tom Avery running past half-dressed, a bucket in each hand. North barns afire. They fired the north barn to draw us, and they're driving the herd off the west range while we— "Where's Kieran?" Annabelle said. "West range, ma'am. He rode out the second he—" "Go! Go fight the fire, go!" She grabbed Sarah's arm as the older woman came out onto the porch. "It's a fire and a raid at once. They lit the barn to pull the men north, and they're stealing the herd out the west while everyone runs for water." "Lord Almighty!" Sarah's face was gray in the orange light. "That's not saddle tramps, child. That's a war plan. That's a general." "I know it." And Annabelle did know it, cold and clear, and the knowing of it was the first moment she understood in her bones what she'd walked into, that she had left the men in the fine coats for men who burned barns as a feint, that the honest West she'd fled toward had its own arranged wickedness, and that the man she'd tied a rag around was riding straight into the center of it in the dark. "Sarah, the men fighting the fire, they'll need water hauled and hands to haul it, and someone keeping count of who's where so nobody's lost in the smoke. Can you run that?" "I can run that." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do the one thing nobody else has time to." Annabelle was already moving. "I'm going to find out who's missing when this is over, and who isn't. And I'm going to write down every single thing that happens tonight while it's still true. Because a man who plans like this has done it before, and will do it again. And the only thing that ever catches a planner is a better record than his own." She spent that night at the long kitchen table with a lamp and paper, and every man who came in off the fire line, and she took it all down, who saw what from where, at what hour, which way the raiders came, and which way they went, the count of the herd before, and the count of the herd after. She did it the way her father had taught her to keep a ledger, because a ledger does not weep and does not panic and does not forget, and by the gray of the false dawn, she had 4 pages of it in her careful, slanting hand, and when Kieran Knox finally rode back in smoke-blacked swaying in the saddle, having ridden the raiders halfway to the county line before losing them at the water, he came into the kitchen and found her there with the lamp guttering and the 4 pages in front of her. "How bad?" she said before he could speak. "They took 200 head." His voice was ash. "Burned the north barn to the ground. Killed a horse that got loose in the pen. We didn't get one of them, not one they knew this range in the dark better than my own men. They—" He stopped. He'd seen the pages. "What's that?" "That," Annabelle said, "is your enemy, or the start of him." She turned the pages toward him. "Sit down, Mr. Knox, before you fall down, and let me show you what I've got, because I think there's a shape in it, and I think you're too close to the fire and too full of rage to see the shape. And I am neither, because I am a shipping clerk's daughter, and I have been reading ledgers for the truth since I was 9 years old." Kieran Knox sat down. She showed him the shape. The raiders had come from the northwest and gone to the southwest both times, every time, not toward the mountains, where a small outfit would run stolen beef to hide it, but toward the flat, toward the rail. They moved cattle faster than men. Driving them could move, which meant fresh horses staged along the route, which meant a base close by with money behind it. They'd fired the barn at the precise hour the moon set. They'd known the herd was on the west range that night, which they could only have known if someone had watched the range that day or been told by someone who worked it. Kieran went very still at that last one. "You're saying somebody told them." "I'm saying somebody could have. I'm saying the shape allows it. I'm not saying who, and I'll not accuse an honest man on a shape." Annabelle met his eyes. "But you moved that herd to the west range yesterday morning. You told me at breakfast. And they hit it last night. That's either the worst luck in Colorado, or it isn't luck at all, and a man who plans like this doesn't leave much to luck." The silence in the kitchen was terrible. "I've got 40 men," Kieran said slowly. "Some of them 10 years with me. I'd have trusted any one of them with my life. I have trusted them with my life." "I know." "And you're telling me one of them. I'm telling you what the shape allows. That's all I'll ever tell you because that's all a ledger knows. The rest is yours to find, and God help you finding it because it's the worst kind of finding there is." She reached across the table, and this time it was she who touched him, her hand flat over his bandaged one, and she didn't take it back. "But you're not finding it alone, Mr. Knox. Whatever else, I've watched enough men break themselves in private trying to carry a thing alone. My father did it, and it stopped his heart. You're not doing it alone. Not while I'm under this roof." Kieran Knox looked down at her hand over his. "You've been here 4 weeks, he said very low. "I have." "You were supposed to be a housekeeper for 3 months, and then take a ticket to anywhere on the line." "I was." "Annabelle." It was the first time he'd used her Christian name, and it came out of him rough, like it had cost something. "I need you to hear me say this clear because I'm not a man who says things twice, and I'll not have it be one more thing a stranger promised you and didn't hold. I didn't stop for you on that platform because I wanted a housekeeper. I told myself I did. I told you I did. I stood there and made you a clean offer of honest work because it was the only offer I had a right to make a woman I'd known the length of a train's arriving." His jaw worked. "But that wasn't the whole truth, and I've been a coward about the rest of it for 4 weeks, and I watched a coward hand you a ticket on that platform, and I'll be damned if I turn into him. So here's the whole truth. I stopped because I saw you on your knees in the dirt refusing to take a wicked man's charity, and I thought there's the thing I've been waiting my whole life to see, and never once did. A person who won't be made small. And I have not had one clear night's sleep since, because I have spent every one of them lying awake terrified that in 6 weeks you'll take a ticket to anywhere on the line, and I'll have to watch you go, and I'll have earned it because I made you a bargain that lets you." Annabelle Porter could not breathe. "You said," she started. "I know what I said. I said work. I said no man tells you otherwise. I'll stand by every word of it. That's exactly why I'm telling you now, instead of doing what men do, which is arrange your life around what they want, and call it caring for you." His hand turned over under hers, so their palms met, and he did not grip. He just let it be there, an offer she could take away from any second. "I'm not asking you for anything. You hear me? I'm not Gerald Harrington, and I'm not those men in the fine coats, and I will never put a debt on you for stopping on that platform, not if you leave tomorrow. But I've watched you not say true things across this table for 4 weeks because you thought it was safer, and I decided tonight, watching my barn burn, that I have run clean out of the time it takes to leave true things unsaid." He almost smiled at his own theft of her words. "That one's yours. I stole it. It's the truest thing I know now." For a long moment, the only sound was the guttering lamp. And then the door banged open, and Tom Avery half fell into the kitchen, white as milk under the smoke on his face, and everything Annabelle might have said went unsaid after all. "Boss?" Tom could barely get it out. "Boss, you got to come. It's old Pete. We found him in the West Line shack. He's boss. He's been shot. Somebody shot him and left him in the shack, and I think he's been there since before the raid. I think he's been there since yesterday, and boss." The boy's voice broke clean through. He's still breathing, but only just, and he's saying a name over and over, and I couldn't make it out, but it wasn't no rustler's name, boss. It was one of ours. Kieran Knox was on his feet before the boy finished. "Which name?" he said, and his voice had gone to the flat, cold place. The place from the platform, the place that made towns step back. "Tom, which name is he saying?" I couldn't make it out clear. "Which name?" "It sounded like Ryland," Tom whispered. "Boss, it sounded like Ryland, and Ryland rode out this morning before anybody was up. Said you sent him to town for lumber, and boss, you didn't send him to town, did you? You didn't send anybody to town." The silence that fell in that kitchen was the loudest thing Annabelle had ever heard. "No," Kieran said. "I didn't send anybody to town." He was moving before the word was finished out the door and across the yard toward the horses, and Annabelle was moving too, grabbing the lamp and Sarah's medicine box off the shelf, where it had sat untouched for years, and Sarah was moving behind her, and the three of them went out into the smoke-gray dawn toward the West Line shack, where an old man had been lying shot for a full day, with the name of a traitor on his lips. Old Pete was the oldest hand on the bar. A man who'd worked the range since before Kieran was born, and when they got to the shack, he was gray as the dawn, and there was too much blood soaked black into the boards under him. And Annabelle knew before she knelt beside him that there wasn't much time, and there wasn't much anyone could do. She'd nursed her father through his last night. She knew the look. But she knelt in the old man's blood and took his cold hand in both of hers anyway, because nobody should say their last true thing alone, and she'd learned that on a train platform. Pete. Kieran was on his knees on the other side, and his voice had gone gentle, gentle, as it had been on the platform, all the flat cold burned away. Pete, it's Kieran. I'm here. We got you. You just hold on now. The old man's eyes came open, milky, searching. Kieran? A thread of a voice. Knew you'd come. Knew it. I'm here. Don't talk. Save it. Won't. The old man's cracked lips moved into something that might once have been a grin. Won't have nothing to save it for, boy, and we both know it, so shut your mouth and let a dying man have his say. A wet, terrible breath. It's Ryland. You hear me? It's Ryland been feeding him. Been feeding him 2 months. I seen him at the creek meeting, a fella seen money change hands, and I braced him on it, old fool that I am. I braced him on it alone, instead of coming to you first, and he shot me, and left me for the buzzards, and rode off to help 'em burn your barn. The old man's hand tightened in Annabelle's, with a strength that startled her. But that ain't the worst, Kieran. That ain't the worst of it. You lean in close now, 'cause I only got the wind to say it once. Kieran leaned in close. The man Ryland's been meeting, old Pete breathed. The man behind it, the money. I seen his face at the creek, Kieran, clear as I see you. It's a man from your past. It's a man you thought you buried. Who? Kieran said, and there was something in it now that was almost fear on the face of a man Annabelle would have sworn didn't own the feeling. Old Pete told him the name, and Annabelle, kneeling in the old man's blood with his cold hand in hers, watched Kieran Knox's face go white as bone in the lamplight, watched 10 years, and a war, and a whole hard-built life fall away from him in an instant, watched the man who did not lose look for the first time like a man who might. That's not possible, Kieran said. That man is dead. I saw them bury— You saw them bury a box, old Pete whispered. Did you see them bury a man? And then the old hand went slack in Annabelle's, and the milky eyes fixed on nothing, and the oldest man on the barquet was gone, having spent his last breath to hand his boss the one truth that could unmake him. For a long moment, nobody in the shack moved. Then Kieran Knox reached out with 2 fingers and closed the old man's eyes gentle as anything, the way he'd set the latch on her broken trunk. And he stayed there, kneeling with his hand over the dead man's face and his back to Annabelle, so she couldn't see what it did to him. And she let him have it because she'd learned that about him too, that some things he'd carry so nobody else had to. When he stood, he was changed. She could see it. Whatever the name was, it had done something to him no rustler and no fire could do, reached into some old buried room in him and thrown the door open. And he stood in the doorway of the shack, with the dawn coming up gray behind him and the dead man at his feet, and a look on his face that Annabelle Porter would remember to the end of her days. Annabelle. He didn't turn around. You asked me on the wagon what the price was, what I paid for the land, for not losing to Colton. I remember. I told you it was mine to carry. You did. It's about to become yours to carry too, whether either of us wants it, because it just rode back out of the grave and it's stealing my cattle and burning my barns, and it has killed a good old man in a line shack, and there's no keeping it from you now. He turned. His face was terrible and calm. So I'm going to tell you the price, Annabelle Porter. Tonight. All of it. Every true thing I've been too much of a coward to say, same as you've been too much of a coward to say yours across that table for a month. Because Pete just spent his last breath teaching me a thing I already knew and kept forgetting. His voice cracked just once and steadied. You don't get to save the true things for later. There isn't always a later. He didn't have one. My mother didn't have one. Your father didn't have one." He looked at her steady over the body of the dead man. "I'm done pretending we do." Sarah Beckett in the doorway had gone gray as the corpse. "Kieran," she said, and there was dread in it, a whole lifetime of dread. "Kieran, whose name did that old man say? Tell me it wasn't. Tell me it wasn't the name I'm thinking." "It was," Kieran said. Sarah put her hand against the doorframe like her legs had gone. "Then God help us all," she whispered. "God help every soul on this ranch, because if that man is a live child—" She turned to Annabelle, and her eyes were wide and wet, and full of a knowledge Annabelle didn't have yet, and desperately wanted. "If that man is alive, then everything Kieran built, and everything Kieran did to build it, and every hard thing this family buried to keep it buried is about to come clawing back up out of the ground. And there ain't a one of us going to walk out of it the same." Annabelle stood in the line shack in the gray dawn light, an old man's blood drying on her hands, a dead woman's shawl around her shoulders. 4 pages of a ledger in her apron, and a name she didn't know. Ringing in a room that had just gone silent with terror, and she understood the way she'd understood on the platform, that she was a thing that had been returned the way she'd understood at the burning barn that she'd fled, one arranged wickedness for another. That whatever she had thought she was walking into when she took this man's clean offer of honest work, it was so much larger and so much older and so much more dangerous than that, and that she was already God, help her all the way inside it, and there was no ticket on any line that could take her back out. Kieran crossed the shack to her. He took her bloodied hands in his bandaged ones, both of them, and he held them, and he looked down at her with that terrible calm. And around them, Sarah wept quietly, and Tom Avery stood white and shaking, and the dead man lay cooling on the boards. "Come back to the house," Kieran said. "There's coffee to make, and a body to tend, and a traitor to hunt, and a ghost to fight, and it's going to be the worst day this ranch has seen in 10 years, and I need you steady. And I've watched you be the steadiest thing in every room you've stood in, since I found you on your knees in the dirt, refusing to be made small." His grip tightened, careful an offer she could still take away. "And tonight when it's done, I'm going to sit you down at that long table one more time, and I'm going to tell you the whole of who I am, and what I've done, and what I paid, and then you're going to decide with the whole truth in front of you for once in your life. Instead of a stranger's pretty lie, whether you take a ticket to anywhere on the line, or whether you stay and fight this thing beside me, and let me spend the rest of my days proving to you that not every man who promises decency hands you a ticket out of town." Annabelle Porter looked up at him. Her hands were shaking in his. Her heart was a wild thing. Every sensible voice her mother ever gave her was screaming to run to take the ticket to get clear of a man with a name like that clawing up out of his past. And she heard those voices, and she honored them because they had kept her alive. And then she set them down. The way Kieran had told her he didn't yet know how to set down Colton, the way she didn't yet know how to set down Prentice and Hale. She set the running voices down anyway, by hand the way he'd said justice had to be made, and she squeezed his bandaged hands back, and she lifted her chin, and she gave him the truest answer she had. "I'll make the coffee," Annabelle said. "You tend the body, and tonight you'll tell me all of it, and I'll listen to all of it, and I'll tell you mine, and then we'll decide together, because I've run clean out of the time it takes to face a hard thing alone. And I think you have too, Kieran Knox, and I think you've had that time run out for 10 years, and just never had anybody sit at your table long enough to notice." She drew a breath that shook only a little. "So no, I'm not taking a ticket. Not today. Today there's work, and you don't leave work half done because it frightens you. My father taught me that, and it's about the only thing those men in the fine coats never managed to take off him, and I'll be damned if I let a ghost with a name take it off me." Something broke across Kieran Knox's face. Not a smile. Still not quite a smile, but the thing that lives one street over from it, relief and grief, and something perilously close to love all at once. "All right," he said rough. "All right then." And they walked out of the line shack together into the terrible gray morning, the living carrying the dead, a traitor riding somewhere ahead of them, and a ghost rising somewhere behind. And Annabelle Porter, The mail-order bride who'd been thrown away like a returned parcel before noon on her first day in Colorado, walked into the worst day the Bar K had seen in 10 years, with her chin up and blood on her hands, and a dead woman's shawl around her shoulders. No longer a thing that had been returned. No longer even quite a housekeeper, but something the valley didn't have a word for yet. Something that was being forged right there in the gray dawn out of grief and steel, and the refusal to be made small. Behind them in the growing light, the burned bones of the north barn still smoked against the sky, and ahead of them, in a house that 4 weeks ago had been holding its breath, the fire needed building, and the coffee needed making, and a man who had buried his past was about to dig it up and lay it at long last on the long scrubbed table in front of the one person who had never once, not for a single moment, been afraid of him. They buried old Pete before noon, and the whole outfit stood bareheaded around the grave while the preacher from town said the words, and Annabelle stood at Kieran's shoulder in the dead woman's shawl and watched 39 men lower the 40th into the ground. 39. Not 40. Ryland's place at the graveside was empty, and every man there knew why, and the emptiness of it was louder than any eulogy. He worked this range 50 years, Kieran said over the grave when the preacher stepped back and looked to him. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He taught me to rope when I was 6. He pulled me out from under a downed horse when I was 11, and never once told my father because he knew I'd get a whipping for riding green stock, and he took that secret to his grave the same as he took a bullet meant to keep him quiet. Kieran looked slowly around the circle of faces. One of the men who stood at this ranch's table put that bullet in him, ate our bread, and took our wages, and sold us to the men who did this. I want every one of you to look at Pete going into the ground, and I want you to remember that a man can smile at you across a bunkhouse for 2 years and be counting your cattle for another man the whole while. His voice didn't harden. It went quieter, which was worse. So I'll say this once, if any other man here has taken that money. If there's a second Judas among us, you come to me tonight on your own legs and confess it, and I'll put you off my land alive. That's my whole mercy, and it expires at sundown. After that, if I find you the way I found Colton. And there's not a man here old enough to remember Colton who wants that. Nobody breathed. Amen, said the preacher weakly into the silence because he didn't know what else to say. Amen, said Kieran Knox and put the first shovelful of dirt on the oldest friend he had. Annabelle watched the men disperse afterward, and she watched how they watched each other. Now sidelong, careful. Every man suddenly a stranger to every other. Kieran had done a thing at that graveside that she understood the moment he did it, because it was a ledger-keeper's move, even though he'd never kept a ledger in his life. He'd made the ranch's fear useful. He'd taken the poison Ryland put in the well and turned it into a lantern, and now every honest man on the Bar K would be watching for the next traitor so hard he'd never have the peace to become one. That was well done, she said quietly, walking back toward the house beside him. It was a cruel thing to do to grieving men. It was a necessary thing to do to frightened men, and you know the difference, which is why you hated doing it. She glanced up at him. You've got a whole language, Kieran Knox, for making yourself out to be worse than you are. I've been 4 weeks learning to translate it. When you say a thing was cruel, you mean it cost you. He stopped walking. You do that, he said. You just see a man all the way down and say it out loud like it's nothing. It isn't nothing. It's the only thing I've got that's worth anything. My looks are middling and my fortune's gone, and my references are from a minister in a city that killed my father. Seeing people true is the whole of my estate. She kept walking so he'd have to follow. Now come inside. You promised me the whole truth tonight, and I've decided tonight is now, because you've got a ghost to fight before sundown, and I'll not have you fight it with a thing this size still hidden in you. You'll fight it clumsy carrying that. Set it down first. He followed her inside. She sat him at the long table where they'd talked away a month of dark hours, and she poured him coffee he didn't drink, and she sat down across from him and folded her hands, the way Sarah folded hers, and she waited. She'd learned that the doorway was the only way through him, so she stood in it. His name. Kieran said at last, "is Silas Vane." The name meant nothing to her. She let it sit. "He came into this valley the same year I came home from the war. Charming man. Educated. Wore a good coat." Kieran's mouth twisted on the word coat, and she understood he'd chosen it for her, a gift and a warning both. "One of your fine table men, Annabelle, only he'd come west to do out here what they do back there." He bought the bank. Then he bought the newspaper. Then he started buying the ranchers, the small ones, first the ones a bad winter had put behind on their notes. He'd call in a note a man couldn't pay, and take the land for 1/10 of its worth, and smile the whole while. And it was all legal, every bit of it, paper and signature, and the law standing right behind him, because he'd bought the law too. Kieran turned the cup. Colton was his man. Colton was the fist. Vane was the mind. When Colton took my father's land while I was at the war, it wasn't Colton's idea. It was never Colton's idea. Colton didn't have an idea in his life. It was Vane. So when you fought Colton, I was fighting the fist and never touching the mind. Took me 2 years to understand that. I got the land back off Colton, some with paper, some without. I told you that on the wagon, and I meant it. But the whole while I thought I was fighting one man. I was fighting Vane's man, and Vane sat in his good coat in his bought bank and watched and let Colton spend himself against me because Colton was expendable to him. Everybody was expendable to him. That's the thing about the men in the fine coats, Annabelle, out here or back east. It's the one thing they all share. Every human soul on God's earth is a line in their ledger, and they'll cross any line out the second it stops adding. Annabelle sat very still. "What happened to Colton?" she said. "You said he was gone. You said a man who spends his name spends it once. You never said gone where." And there it was, the thing under everything. The door at the bottom of all the other doors, and she watched Kieran Knox arrive at it and stop, and she watched him decide the way he'd decided on the platform, the way she'd taught herself to decide fast and clear and without a backward glance. "Colton came at me the last time on the North Range," Kieran said. "November, 10 years back next month. He came with 6 men to burn me out the way they'd tried before. Only I'd had word and I was ready, and we met them on the flat above the creek." His voice had gone flat and far, the war voice, the voice he'd sworn never to put in her. "There was shooting. My men and his. When it was done, 4 of his were dead, and 2 of mine and Colton was on the ground with a bullet in him, and he wasn't dead but he was dying and he knew it." Kieran looked at his own hands. "And he told me. Right there dying the way Pete told me. He told me it was Vane. He told me everything, the bank, the law, the plan to take the whole valley one bad winter at a time, and he told me that if I killed him, Vane would just find another fist, but if I let him live and testify, we could take Vane down together in the law in the open and end it. And you." "I let him bleed out," Kieran said. The kitchen was silent. "I knelt there," he said, "and I listened to Colton offer me the one clean way to end it. The law, a trial justice made in the open, where God and everyone could see it. And I looked at the man who took my father's land, who put my father in an early grave, the same as your fine table men, put yours who'd burned my barns and shot my men, and would have burned me alive in my own house, and I decided that Colton didn't deserve a trial." His jaw worked. "I told myself it was because Vane owned the law, and a trial would come to nothing. And that was true, Annabelle. It was true. Vane owned the court and the jury and the newspaper that'd have printed the verdict, and a trial would have gone nowhere, and I've told myself that for 10 years, and it is true." He looked up at her, and his eyes were terrible. "But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is, I wanted him dead. I wanted it in my hands and my chest and every part of me the war taught to want it, and I dressed that wanting up in good reasons the way Vane dresses his in law, and I knelt there, and I let a dying man bleed instead of trying to save him and turn him, and I told my men afterward that he was gone before we reached him. And they believed me because they wanted to. And that's the price, Annabelle. That's what I paid for this land. Not the fighting. Any man can fight. I paid by becoming, for one November afternoon, on the flat above the creek, exactly the thing I've spent my whole life swearing I'd never turn into. I paid with the part of me that was better than vain. I spent it, and I have not been able to buy it back in 10 years of trying. Annabelle Porter sat across the table from him and did not speak for a long time. She thought about her father, who never harmed a soul, dead at his desk. She thought about the men in the fine coats, free as air. She thought about herself on the platform telling Kieran she'd rather take her chances with a stranger than one more day among people who wore decency like a coat. And she thought about what it would mean, what it would cost her, what it would cost the whole shape of the world she'd fled toward if the honest West she'd bet her life on turned out to have its own men who did harm and dressed it up in reasons. "You told your men Colton was dead when you reached him," she said slowly, "but you just said you let him bleed. So which is it? Did you shoot him, Kieran, in that fight? Or did you find him already shot and let him die when you might have saved him?" "I found him shot," Kieran said. "One of my men put the bullet in him in the fight fair in the open, both of them shooting. I didn't fire the shot that killed Colton. I want to be exact with you because you've had a belly full of men who weren't. I didn't murder him. It'd be a cleaner sin if I had. Maybe at least it'd have happened in the heat of it. What I did was worse and quieter. I found him dying, and I could have tried to stop the bleeding, hard-packed a wound, ridden for the doctor, given him the chance to live and testify, and end Vane in the open the way he offered. And I chose not to. I chose to let the dark do my wanting for me, so my hands would stay clean of it. That's the coward's version of the thing, Annabelle. That's the fine coat version. Arrange it so somebody else does the killing, even if the somebody else is just a bullet already fired and a wound you decline to tend. I declined to tend a wound and told myself the law made me do it." He pushed the untouched coffee away. "That's your whole truth. That's the man who stopped for you on the platform. Now you've got it, all of it, and you can decide with it in front of you instead of a stranger's pretty lie." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire. And then Annabelle Porter did the thing that Kieran Knox told Sarah afterward he had not seen coming, not in 10 years of bracing for the moment. Somebody learned the truth and looked at him different. She laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, and it wasn't an amused one. It was the laugh of a person who has been braced for a blow and finds the blow is not the one they feared. It came up out of her before she could stop it, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and tears stood in her eyes at the same time. And Kieran stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You think that's the worst thing you could have told me?" she said when she could speak. "You've been sitting there 10 years thinking that's the confession that ends you. Kieran Knox. You let a dying murderer bleed instead of nursing him back to health so he could testify in a court his own boss owned, a court that would have freed him, a court that would have used his testimony to hang you for the shooting your own man did in a fair fight. That's your black sin. That's the thing you've buried under 6 years of shut-up rooms. It's not nothing. I didn't say it was nothing. I said it's not what you think it is." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, hard angry at them for coming. "Do you want to know what the men in the fine coats did, Kieran? The ones who killed my father? They didn't let a wound go untended. They dug the wound. They took a firm they knew was rotten, and they went out and found honest, careful men. Like my father, men who'd worked 40 years for a little safety, and they smiled and shook those men's hands and took the safety, knowing it would ruin them. That's not declining to save a drowning enemy. That's throwing decent men in the river for profit and going home to a warm supper. And do you know what the difference between you and them is? The difference you've been too close to your own guilt to see for 10 years. She leaned across the table. You've spent a decade unable to sleep over one dying man you didn't save. They've never lost one night over 100 they drowned. That's the whole difference between a hard man and a wicked one, Kieran. It was never in the deed. It's in whether the deed can still find you in the dark, and yours finds you every night. That's not the mark of the thing you're afraid you became. That's the mark of the thing that kept you from it." Kieran Knox looked at her across the long scrub table, and something happened in his face that she had never seen happen in any man's. Something she didn't have a word for, a kind of coming apart That was also a coming together 10 years of a wound finally being tended by hands that weren't his own. "Sarah said you opened a door in me," he said low. "On the platform. She said it doesn't happen. Sarah talks too much. Sarah's never once been wrong about a person in 30 years. He reached across the table slow, giving her every chance to pull back, and covered her hand with his. "Annabelle, I've told you the worst of me now, the whole of it. And you sat there, and you took the thing I was most afraid of, and you—" His voice cracked. "You turned it into the reason I'm not what I feared. I don't know what to do with that. I've never once in my life had a person do that. My mother died before I could confess it, and Sarah, I could never bring myself to tell, and there's never been another soul I trusted with it. And you've had it 4 minutes, and you've already—" He stopped. He couldn't finish. "Already what?" Annabelle said very gently. "Already set it down for me," Kieran said. "The thing I couldn't set down myself. You picked it up off my back like it weighed nothing. Like the trunk latch. You just reached over and fixed the thing that was bent." And Annabelle Porter understood in that moment, sitting at the long table with an old man freshly in the ground, and a ghost rising in the hills, and a traitor riding somewhere ahead of them, that she had fallen in love with Kieran Knox. Not on the platform, not over the month of dark hour talks, but right here, right now, in the exact moment she'd watched a hard and frightening man hand her the worst thing he'd ever done, and trust her not to run with it. She'd fled Boston to get away from men who couldn't be trusted with a woman's whole self. And she'd found at the far edge of the country, in the ruins of a life, she'd lost a man who'd just trusted her with his. She didn't say it. There wasn't time, and a ghost was rising, and she'd learned to set true things down and pick them up again when the work was done. But she turned her hand over under his, so their palms met the way he'd done it in the shack, and she let it be there, and that was its own kind of saying. "Now," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was proud of it. "Tell me about Vane risen from the grave. Because Pete saw a man you watch them bury, and dead men don't burn barns. So one of two things is true. Either Vane never died and you were lied to, or somebody wants you to believe Vane's come back and is using his name to unmake you from the inside because they know it's the one name that can. Which is it, and how do we find out? And we do it before sundown, because you gave a second Judas until sundown to confess, and I mean to have you clear-eyed when he does or doesn't." Kieran stared at her. "You just—" he started. "I keep ledgers, Kieran. A dead man walking is a discrepancy in the ledger. You don't panic at a discrepancy. You find it. Now. Did you see Vane die, or did you see them bury a box?" "I saw them bury a box," Kieran said slowly, and she watched him climb up out of 10 years of dread into the cold, clear place where problems got solved. It was 2 years after Colton. Vane's bank failed. I never knew why the panic of '73 came late to us, and there were men after him. Men he'd ruined, and one morning the word went round that he'd been found dead in his rooms, and there was a funeral, and a box, and a grave up on the hill behind the church, and I stood at the back of that funeral. Annabelle and I watched them lower the box, and I felt—" he grimaced. "I felt cheated. God forgive me. I felt cheated that he'd got a quiet death in bed and never had to answer for one thing he did. But I never saw the body. There was no viewing. The box was closed. They said he'd been dead 3 days in the heat." "Who said?" "The undertaker. Man named—" Kieran stopped dead. Annabelle watched it hit him. "Man named Ryland," Kieran said, and his voice had gone to nothing. "Old Ryland, the undertaker. Our Ryland's father." The kitchen went cold and silent, and outside the window the afternoon was already sliding toward the sundown he'd set as a traitor's deadline, and Annabelle Porter felt the whole shape of it click into place, the way a bent latch clicks home. "There it is," she breathed. "There's your discrepancy. The man who swore Vane was in that box was the father of the man who's been feeding your cattle to Vane for 2 months. Kieran. Vane never died. He bought himself a funeral the same way he bought a bank and a newspaper and a court. He found a man he could buy an undertaker with a son to raise, and he paid for a closed box, and 3 days' heat, and a quiet grave. and he walked out of this valley, a dead man free as air. No men chasing a corpse. And he's spent 10 years somewhere building himself back up, and now he's come home, and he's using the Undertaker's son to bleed you slow, and he's using his own dead name as a knife, because he knows Kieran. A man like that always knows that the name Silas Vane is the one thing on this earth that can make Kieran Knox afraid. Kieran Knox stood up so fast the chair went over backward. "He's here," he said. "He's not coming. He's here. He's been here. A man doesn't run this from a distance. Not the timing of it, not the knowing which range the herd was on. He's close. He's in the valley. He's been sitting in it watching me. The way he watched me spend Colton waiting. And Ryland's the hand, but Vane's the mind. Same as always. And he's—" Kieran turned to the window to the westering sun, and his whole body had gone taut as a drawn wire. "Sundown. I told the men sundown. I told them any second Judas comes forward by sundown and lives. And Ryland's already run. But if Vane's got one hand inside my outfit, why not two? Why not three? Why would a man that careful buy one trader when he could buy several and let them watch each other?" "Then we don't wait for sundown," Annabelle said, already on her feet. "We can't. If there's a second man, he's not going to confess Kieran, he's going to run at sundown the way Ryland ran. Or worse, he's going to do one last thing for Vane on his way out the door. What's the one thing left to hit? The barn's burned. The herd's halved. What hasn't he touched? What would break you?" And Kieran Knox looked at her across the kitchen, and the blood drained clean out of his face, and he said one word. "You." The window behind him exploded inward. Annabelle didn't hear the shot until after the glass. That was the thing she'd remember. The glass came first, and the sound came a half-beat behind it, and Kieran was already moving before she understood what was happening already across the room, already hitting her low and hard, and taking her down behind the heavy oak table as a second shot chewed a fist-sized hole out of the doorframe where her head had been. "Down, stay, down." His body was over hers, his arm across her back, pinning her to the floor behind the table, and she could feel his heart going like a hammer against her shoulder, and hear him counting under his breath. Counting the seconds between shots, and a third shot splintered the tabletop above them and rained sawdust down into her hair. "Rifle," Kieran said against her ear. "Cold working, not afraid, or afraid and using it. Long gun off the rise east of the house, single shooter, he's bolt action, so we've got about 4 seconds between, and the table'll hold a Winchester round, but not forever." A fourth shot, and this one punched clean through the oak an inch above their heads, and Annabelle heard Kieran's breath catch because it had gone through the table wasn't going to hold. "That's not a Winchester," he said, and for the first time there was something under his voice that might have been fear. "That's a Sharps. That's a buffalo gun. That'll go through this table and the wall behind it and the next wall too. We can't stay here. Annabelle, listen to me. When I say go, we go for the cellar door. It's stone, it'll stop a Sharps, and we go together, and we go fast, and you do not look up. You understand me? You do not look up, no matter what." "Where's Sarah?" Annabelle gasped. "Kieran, where's Sarah? She was in the root cellar. She went down for potatoes an hour ago. She's already behind stone. She's safe." Another shot lower this time, and Annabelle felt the wind of it, actually felt it move the air by her ankle. He's adjusting. He's walking his shots down. He knows we're behind the table, and he's shooting through it a piece at a time. Annabelle, on 3. 1. Kieran. 2. "Kieran, if this is—" She grabbed a fistful of his shirt. There wasn't time, and she said it anyway because an old man had died that morning, teaching her there wasn't always a later. "The thing I couldn't say across the table for a month. I know," Kieran Knox said. "I've known for weeks. Say it after." 3. And they went. They came up off the floor together and crossed the kitchen bent double, and the Sharps roared, and the whole doorframe splintered where they'd been, and Kieran had her by the wrist and hauled her through the pantry door, as a round punched a hole through the pantry wall clean past her face, and then they were at the cellar door, the heavy one, the stone-lined one his grandfather had built to keep ice through the summer, and Kieran wrenched it open and shoved her down the first 3 steps, and came down after her, and dragged it shut, and the next round hit the outside of that stone-lined door and stopped, and Annabelle Porter stood in the sudden dark, with her back against cold stone, and her heart trying to come up out of her throat, and Kieran Knox's arms braced on either side of her, both of them alive, both of them breathing hard, close enough in the dark that she could feel the heat coming off him. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You're not hit," Kieran said. It wasn't quite a question. His hands were moving over her shoulders, her arms checking, and she realized his hands were shaking. The hands that hadn't shaken, tending Pete's dying. The hands that stayed level facing armed men, they were shaking now over her. "Tell me you're not hit." "I'm not hit." "Kieran?" "I'm not hit." She caught his shaking hands and held them still against her, and in the dark of the cellar, with a killer's rifle silent above them, she felt him let out a breath that seemed to come up from the floor of him. "You're the one that put yourself between me and a buffalo gun. You great fool. You don't do that, you don't." "I'll do it every day of my life," Kieran Knox said. "And you'll not once talk me out of it, so save your breath." And in the dark, with the whole world narrowed down to cold stone and a shaking man, and the silence of a gun waiting to see if they'd come out, Annabelle understood that the thing she'd meant to say across the table had already been said by both of them without a word in the geometry of a man's body thrown over hers between the glass and the gun. Above them, faint through the stone, they heard it hoofbeats, a single horse moving off the eastern rise, fast unhurried in its speed. The way a professional is unhurried, a man who'd done his work and knew it, and was leaving on his own schedule. "He's going," Annabelle whispered. "He's going because he thinks it's done," Kieran said grimly. "He put 4 rounds through that table, and a 5th through the pantry, and he saw us go down at least twice, and he can't have seen us reach the stone from that angle. He's riding back to Vane to tell him Knox's woman is dead, or Knox is, or both, which means..." And now the cold, clear place had him fully. She could hear it, the mind working under the fear. "Which means for a day, maybe 2, Vane thinks he's won. Thinks he's cut the one thing out of me that mattered. And a man who thinks he's won Annabelle gets careless," Annabelle finished. "Gets careless," Kieran agreed. "Comes out of the shadow to look at what he's done. 10 years he's been a ghost. He'll not be able to help himself. He'll want to see the bar-K brought low, with his own eyes want to stand where he stood before and watch me broken the way he couldn't watch me broken by Colton. That's the wanting in a man like that. It's the only thing in him that isn't cold. The wanting to see it." Kieran's hands tightened on hers in the dark. "So we give it to him. We let the valley believe it worked. We let the word go round that there was a killing at the bar-K, and we let it stay vague on who, and we wait. And Silas Vane comes home to look at his handiwork. And this time, his voice went to the flat, cold place, but there was something new under it now, something that hadn't been there through the whole telling of Colton, a steadiness, a cleanness. This time, I don't let the dark do my wanting for me. This time, there's a witness. This time, it's in the open. This time, I do it the way Colton offered, and I refuse the way I've owed the world for 10 years. I take Silas Vane in front of God and the valley and the law alive, and I make him answer. Every ruined rancher, every stolen acre. Your kind of man and my kind of enemy, one and the same, finally made to answer out loud. Woo-ha-ta. Annabelle Porter stood in the dark and held the hands of the man she loved and understood that he had just in the space of a single afternoon been handed back the thing he'd spent 10 years unable to buy the chance to do right, the exact thing he'd once done wrong. Colton had offered him justice in the open, and Kieran had chosen the dark. Now Vane, rising out of the same grave, was offering it again. A second chance at the one choice that had unmade him. "You know what this is," she said softly. "I know what this is. It's the same choice, 10 years later. The dying man on the flat offering you the clean way, and you took the dark one. And now it's come back around the whole of it dressed up in the same man's name. I know." His forehead came down against hers in the dark, and she felt him breathe. "That's how I know it's real, Annabelle. That's how I know it's Vane, and not just his name being used. Because no man alive could arrange a thing this perfect to hand me back the exact choice I failed 10 years to the month on the same range over the same ghost. No man's that clever. Only God arranges a second chance that clean, and only Vane would be arrogant enough to rise out of a grave and hand it to me thinking it's a trap. A sound came out of him that was almost the laugh she'd been waiting a month to hear. He thinks he's giving me the choice again, so he can watch me fail it again. And he doesn't know he can't know because he's never once in his life sat across a table from a person and told them the worst thing he ever did. He doesn't know that 4 hours ago, a shipping clerk's daughter reached across that table and set the whole weight of it down off my back. He lifted his head. Even in the dark, she could feel him looking at her. He handed me the choice again to break me, Kieran Knox said. But I'm not the man who knelt on that flat 10 years ago. Annabelle. I'm not carrying what I was carrying. You took it off me this afternoon, and I don't think you even knew you were doing it. And now when Silas Vane comes home to watch me fail... His hands found the sides of her face in the dark. Careful, reverent, an offer she could pull away from and didn't. He's going to find a man who can finally do it right. Because of you. Because a woman I found on her knees in the dirt, refusing to be made small, reached across a table and made me clean enough to try again. Above them, the last of the hoofbeats faded into the hills. And in the dark of the stone cellar, with a killer riding back to a ghost with false news, and the whole valley about to be let believe a lie that would draw an old evil out of hiding, Annabelle Porter reached up in the blackness and put her hands over Kieran Knox's hands, where they cradled her face, and she made her decision the way she'd learned to make them fast and clear, and without one backward glance. Then let's bury me, she said. Let the valley think I'm dead. Let Vane come home to gloat over my grave. And when he does, when the man who wears decency like a coat comes to stand at the grave of a woman who was thrown away like a returned parcel 4 weeks ago, I'll be standing behind him, Kieran alive with my 4 pages of ledger and my own 2 eyes, and I'll be the witness. I'll be the thing the law can't buy, and the ghost can't kill, and the coat can't cover. I'll be the one who saw it true and wrote it down and won't be made small. Her thumbs moved over the backs of his hands in the dark. You gave me honest work on that platform, Kieran Knox. Well, this is the work. And I don't leave work half done because it frightens me. My father taught me that, and it's about the only inheritance those fine coat men left me, and I am going to spend all of it catching the kind of man who killed him. For a long moment, Kieran Knox didn't answer. Then in the dark, she felt him do the thing she'd waited a month to feel him do. She felt Kieran Knox smile full and real, and without one shadow on it, felt it in the change of the air between them. And when he spoke, his voice had a thing in it she'd never heard there, not once. Not through Pete's death, or Colton's confession, or the Buffalo Gun's roar. Hope. Annabelle Porter, he said. The whole valley threw you away. And I have spent 4 weeks trying to find the words to tell you that the day they did was the luckiest day of my entire life, and I couldn't find them, and I've just now found them in a root cellar with a dead man's grave to dig and a false one on top of it. His hands tightened. You are the finest thing that ever came to the Bar K. Finer than the land. Finer than anything I fought Colton for, or buried Vane for, or built out of 10 years of not sleeping. And when this is done, when Vane's answered and the ranch is safe, and there's no ghost left in these hills, I'm going to court you properly in the open in front of the same town that watched you thrown away. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure not one soul in this valley ever again mistakes you for a thing that can be returned. That's not a bargain, and it's not an offer of work. That's a promise. The first one I've made a woman in 10 years, and the last one I ever mean to make. And then, before she could answer, boots on the stone above them, and Sarah Beckett's voice, ragged with terror, calling down through the cellar door. Kieran! Annabelle! Oh God! Oh dear God! There's blood all over the kitchen floor. There's blood everywhere. Answer me for the love of God. One of you, answer me. We're here, Sarah. Kieran called up, and his voice had changed again, gone strong and sure in a way it hadn't been all day. "We're both here. We're both alive. The blood's from the glass, not from us. Open the door. We've got a great deal to do before sundown, and not much of it's what the men are expecting, and I'm going to need you to help me tell the biggest lie this valley's ever heard." The cellar door swung open, and gray daylight fell down the stone steps, and Sarah Beckett stood at the top of them with her hand pressed to her heart and tears pouring down her broad face, and she looked down at the two of them standing close together in the dark. Annabelle's hands still over Kieran's, and even through her terror and her tears, something shifted in the old woman's face, some old grief finally easing. "I knew it," Sarah whispered. "The day he brought you up that road in the wagon. I told you, child. I said that door doesn't open. I said it doesn't happen." She wiped her face with the back of her hand and let out a wet, broken laugh. "Well, look at the two of you. Look at you, standing in the dark, holding hands over a lie you're about to tell the whole county. And if that isn't the most Knox thing I ever saw courting in a root cellar with a killer on the loose." She stopped. Her face changed. "Wait, a lie? What lie? Kieran Knox, what lie am I helping you tell?" Kieran took Annabelle's hand and led her up out of the dark, up the stone steps into the ruined kitchen, with its shattered window and its splintered table, and the blood that was only glass across the floor. And he stood there in the wreckage of the room where they'd talked away a month of dark hours. And he looked at Sarah Beckett, who had raised him, and he told her the shape of what they were about to do. "Sarah," Kieran said, "by nightfall, I need the whole valley to believe that Annabelle Porter is dead." Sarah Beckett sat down hard in the one chair the buffalo gun hadn't ruined. "You want me to help you tell this valley that girl is in the ground?" she said, "when she's standing in front of me with glass in her hair and both eyes open." "I do. Kieran Knox. I have known you 30 years, and I have helped you bury one hard truth already." She caught herself, glanced at Annabelle, saw in her face that the truth was already told, and let out a breath. "And I see she knows about Colton too, so I'll speak plain. I helped you carry that. I've never once judged you for it, but I will not stand in a churchyard and weep false tears over an empty box while that child hides in a cellar. There's a line, boy. Even for you. That's blasphemy." "There'll be no box and no churchyard," Kieran said. "No preacher, no burial, no lie told to God. That's the line, and I'll not cross it, and you're right to hold me to it." He crouched down in front of her chair, so his eyes were level with hers, the way Annabelle had watched him crouch by her broken trunk. "The lie's smaller than that, and meaner in a different way. We don't announce a death. We just let the valley do what the valley does. There was shooting at the Bar K. Windows shot out blood on the floor, and there is blood, Sarah, from the glass, real blood the men'll see when they come running. We say nothing. We deny nothing. We let Annabelle disappear from every eye but the three in this room, and we let the men and the town fill in the silence themselves, because a town that watched a woman thrown away on a train platform is a town that'll believe the worst of her fate without being told one word of it. Vane's man rode off certain he'd killed somebody. Vane will hear it from him, and then he'll hear the valley's silence confirming it. And a silence we never once spoke into is not a lie told to God. It's a truth we decline to correct, same as—" He stopped. "Same as a wound you decline to tend." Annabelle finished quietly from across the room. Kieran looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Same as that, I know it. I hear myself doing it again, choosing the quiet, dark thing over the loud, clean one, and I'd not blame either of you for stopping me. But this time, there's a difference, and the difference is her." He nodded at Annabelle. "Last time I declined to tend a wound, so a bad man would die, and I'd stay clean of it. This time I declined to correct a silence, so a bad man will come out into the open, where I'll take him in front of witnesses and the law. The dark's the same. What I do with it isn't. 10 years ago, I used the dark to hide a killing. Now I use it to bait a trial." He stood. "You taught me the difference between a hard thing and a wicked one is whether it can find you in the dark, Annabelle. Well, This one I can look at in full daylight. That's how I know it's the right one." Sarah Beckett looked from him to Annabelle and back, and something in her old face gave way. "All right," she said. "God forgive me, all right. But hear me, both of you. I'll help you set the trap. I'll hold my tongue, and I'll let the valley believe what it wants, and I'll not correct a soul. But that girl does not leave this ranch, and she does not go near Silas Vane when he comes, and she stays behind stone the whole while, because I have buried enough people I love off this land, and I will not—" Her voice cracked. "I will not bury a false grave today and dig a true one tomorrow. You promise me she stays clear." "Sarah," Annabelle started. "I'm not asking you, child. I'm asking him." And Kieran Knox stood in the wrecked kitchen and looked at Annabelle, and Annabelle looked back at him, and they both knew what Sarah was asking, and they both knew it couldn't be given, because the whole trap turned on Annabelle being the witness, being the one thing the law couldn't buy, and there was no version of it where she stayed behind stone. "I can't promise that," Kieran said. Sarah's face crumpled. "I can't promise it because it isn't mine to promise," he went on gently. "It's hers. She's not a thing I put behind stone for safekeeping Sarah. I'll not do to her what the men in the coats did, arrange her life around what I want and call it caring for her. She came west to stop being a woman men decided things about. I'll not be one more man deciding." He turned to Annabelle. "So I'll ask you instead in front of Sarah, and whatever you say, I'll hold to it. Do you stay behind stone, where I know you're safe? Or do you stand in the open as the witness and take the risk that comes with it?" Annabelle Porter didn't hesitate. "I've been safe behind stone my whole life," she said. "Behind my father's respectability and my good Boston name, and my references from a minister. And it didn't stop the men in the fine coats from killing my father, and it didn't stop a whole town from laughing at me on my knees in the dirt. Safety behind stone is a thing that gets taken off you the moment a powerful man decides to take it. The only safety I've ever had that couldn't be taken," she looked at Kieran, "is the truth in my own two eyes and the record in my own two hands. That's the estate the coatmen left me, and it's the only one they couldn't touch. I'm the witness, Sarah. I stand in the open, not because Kieran wants it, because it's mine and I choose it, and I've run clean out of the time it takes to let someone else be brave for me." Sarah Beckett wept. Then openly, the way old women weep who have seen too much. And she reached out and took Annabelle's hand in both of hers and held it hard. "Your mother," she said. "Whoever she was, wherever she is, she raised a lioness and never got to see it. That's the cruelest thing I know about death. It takes them before they get to see." She pressed Annabelle's hand to her wet cheek. "But I see it, child. I see it, and I'll help you. God help me, I'll help you both." The trap took 2 days to build, and every hour of it cost. They moved Annabelle into the cellar and let the men believe what the men believed. And Kieran watched the belief take hold across his own outfit, like a sickness. Watched hard. Grown men go quiet and gray. Watched Tom. Avery's eyes fill up when he thought no one was looking. Watched 39 mourners, who'd buried Pete in the morning, fall to mourning a second soul by nightfall, and it was the worst thing Kieran had done since the flat above the creek, letting them grieve a woman who was eating supper 12 feet under their boots. "They love you," he told Annabelle in the cellar on the first night, bringing her down a plate. "You've been here 4 weeks, and my whole outfit's grieving you like blood. Tom won't eat. Old Willis carved you a little bird out of pine this afternoon to put on the grave that isn't there, and I had to take it off him and tell him it wasn't decided yet, there might not be. I lied to a 60-year-old man crying over a whittled bird. Annabelle." He set the plate down. His hands weren't steady. "I've done a lot of hard things. This is the one I'll answer for longest." "Then let them stop grieving," Annabelle said gently. "Tell them the truth. Not the town, just the men. They love you. They'll hold a secret for you." "Yeah, I can't. Any one of them could be Vane's second hand. I trust them with my life. I told you that, and I was wrong once already this week, and I'll not bet your true life on my judgment of 40 men, when my judgment already missed Ryland for 2 months. He sat down heavily on the cellar steps. "That's the cost of Vane, Annabelle. He doesn't just steal cattle, he poisons the trust. He makes it so a man can't tell his own grieving hands that the woman they're weeping for is alive, because he can't be sure one of them won't sell it. That's the true theft. Not the herd, the trust. I'll get the herd back. I don't know that I'll ever get the trust back watching my own men grieve a lie and not being able to stop it. Annabelle came and sat beside him on the cold stone step close, and after a moment, he put his arm around her, and she let him, and they sat in the lamplight of the cellar like two people much older than they were, tired down to the bone. "When it's over," she said, "you tell them all together. Every man. You stand them up and you tell them the whole of it, the trap, the lie, why you couldn't trust them with it, and you let them be angry because they'll have earned the right. And then you let them see me walk out alive. And a man who watches a woman he grieved walk back out of the grave, Kieran, that man doesn't lose his trust in you. That man would follow you into hell." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're carrying this like it's Colton all over again. It isn't. Colton you did in the dark and hid forever. This you do in the dark for 3 days and then bring out into the light for everyone. That's not the same sin. That's the opposite of it. You're using the same tool to build the reverse thing." He was quiet a long moment. "How do you do that?" he said finally. "Do what?" "Take a thing I've been hating myself over for 3 days and turn it inside out, so it's the proof of my mending instead of the proof of my rot. You did it with Colton. You're doing it with this. It's like he searched for it. It's like you can see the same act from an angle I can't reach from inside it. Sarah's known me 30 years, and she can't do it. She loves me, and she can't. What is that?" Annabelle thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to answer him. "I think it's because you look at everything you do through the war," she said slowly. "Through the worst thing you ever saw and the worst thing you ever became. Every choice you make, you're standing on that flat above the creek, measuring it against the man you were afraid to turn into. So every hard thing looks like a step back toward him. But I never stood on that flat, Kieran. I stand somewhere else. I stand at my father's desk looking at a decent man dead over money, and from that spot everything you do looks like the opposite of the men who killed him. You keep measuring yourself against the worst thing you might become. I keep measuring you against the worst thing I've already survived. And from where I stand..." She turned and looked at him in the lamplight. "You're not close to the darkness, Kieran Knox. You're the furthest thing from it I've ever met. You're just standing too near your own to see it." Kieran Knox looked at her in the cellar light for a long, long moment. And then he kissed her. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't taken. It was slow, and it was asked his hand coming up to the side of her face the way it had in the dark 2 nights before. An offer she could turn from, and Annabelle Porter, who had come west to be a bride and been thrown away like a returned parcel, who had braced for a month against the crude want she'd learned to expect from men turned toward it instead, and kissed him back in the cellar in the lamplight, with a false grave being dug above them, and a real one still fresh in the churchyard, and a killer riding somewhere in the hills. When they came apart, neither of them spoke for a moment. "I meant what I said in the cellar the first day," Kieran said low, "about courting you proper, in the open, in front of the whole town. I meant every word." "I know you did. I'll not do it now. Not with all this hanging. It wouldn't be right asking you a thing this size with a gun still out there. You might say yes just from the fear, and I'd never know if it was the fear talking, and neither would you, and that's no way to start." He touched her face. "So I'm going to wait. I'm going to catch Silas Vane and answer for Pete, and get my herd back, and make this land safe again, and then when there's not one shadow left on it, I'm going to stand you up in front of God in the valley, and ask you clean in daylight with your whole free mind. Because you deserve to be chosen by a man with nothing pressing on him but the choosing. Not claimed in a crisis, chosen in the calm." Annabelle Porter's eyes filled, and this time she didn't fight it. "That," she said, "is the most decent thing anyone has ever said to me, and I want you to know," her voice shook, "that whatever I say, when you ask me clean in the daylight with my whole free mind, I already know it now. In this cellar in the fear, and I'm telling you now precisely because you're too honorable to let me say it now, so that when you ask me clean, you'll know it wasn't the fear. I choose you too, Kieran Knox. I chose you the moment you handed me the worst thing you'd ever done, and trusted me not to run with it. Ask me clean whenever you like. The answer was decided in a cellar, and it'll not change in the daylight. Above them, faint, a bell began to toll. They both went still. That's the church bell, Kieran said slowly. In town. Tolling. Tolling for what? And Kieran Knox's face changed because he understood before she did, and the understanding was terrible. For you, he said. The valley's decided. 2 days of silence and blood on my floor, and a woman vanished. They've made up their minds. That bell's tolling for Annabelle Porter. He was on his feet. Which means the words crossed the whole valley by now. Which means Vane's heard it confirmed, not from his man, this time from the church, from the town itself, ringing you into the ground. There's no confirmation a man like Vane trusts more than a town's own bell. He turned to her, and there was something wild in him now. The trap sprung, the fish taking the hook. He'll come now. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. He can't help it. The bell's rung. His enemy's broken. And Silas Vane has waited 10 years in a false grave for the sound of the bar K brought low, and now the church itself is ringing it for him, and he will come to see. He was right. Silas Vane came on the third night. He came the way Kieran said he would, not hidden, not skulking, but openly riding up the north road in the last light in a good coat on a good horse. An educated man come to survey his handiwork. So certain of his victory that he brought only 2 men with him, because a man who has won does not need an army to look at what he's won. And Kieran Knox, who had spent 3 days seeding his own certainty, watched from the darkened house as the ghost of Silas Vane rode back onto Bar K land for the first time in a decade, and felt 10 years of dread turn at last into something clean and cold and ready. There he is, Kieran breathed at the window. 10 years, there he is. Annabelle beside him in the dark looked at the man on the road and felt a strange lurch because she'd built a monster in her mind, and the man riding up was almost ordinary silver-haired, straight-backed, mild-looking, a banker, a man you'd trust with your money, which was of course exactly the point, exactly the horror. He looked like Prentice. He looked like Hale. He looked like every man in a fine coat who had ever smiled at a decent person and taken everything they had. He looks like them, she whispered. The men who killed my father. He looks just like them. He is them, Kieran said. Same animal, different valley. Now listen to me. It goes the way we said. Kieran let him in, let him talk, let him gloat. A man like that can't not gloat. He's waited 10 years to say it out loud, and there's no audience. He wants more than the man he thinks he's broken. And when he says it, when he confesses it, the funeral, the false death, Ryland's father, the plan, all of it, the way men like that always do when they think they've won. That's when the witnesses come out. The men outside. The county marshal, Sarah, rode 2 days to fetch from the next county the one Vane doesn't own. And you. He turned to her. You're the last Annabelle. You don't come out until I say your name. Because the moment Silas Vane sees the woman he thinks he killed walk alive out of the dark, holding 4 pages of ledger, everything in him breaks at once, and a broken man says everything. You're not just a witness. You're the thing that shatters him. Wait for your name. I'll wait for my name. On my life, on everything, you wait for it. Kieran. She caught his sleeve. I wait for my name, but you... And now it was her hands that weren't steady. You promised me a thing in the cellar an hour ago. You promised me the calm, the daylight. You do not do anything tonight that takes the daylight away from us. You hear me. Whatever he says, however he gloats, however much of Pete and Colton and 10 years he pours into your face to break you. You remember there's a woman waiting in the dark for you to ask her clean in the calm, and you do not throw that away for the pleasure of the dark thing. Not again. Not ever again. Kieran Knox looked at her and put his hand over her hand on his sleeve. That's why I'll do it right, he said. You just gave me the reason. 10 years I had nothing to keep me on the clean side of it but my own stubbornness, and stubbornness runs out. Now I've got you waiting in the daylight. A man'll stay clean for a thing like that when he wouldn't stay clean for his own soul. You're my reason, Annabelle. Wait for your name." And he went to open the door for the man he'd buried. What passed in that room, Annabelle heard from the dark of the next room through a door left open, a hand's width with her 4 pages of ledger against her heart, and Sarah's hand gripping hers so hard it ached, and the county marshal crouched silent on her other side. She heard Kieran let Vane in, heard him offer the ghost a drink with a hollow flatness that Vane God help him mistook for defeat. Knox. Vane's voice was everything she'd feared, and worse, warm, cultured kind. A voice you'd trust. "I confess I wasn't certain you'd receive me, after everything." A pause, a chair. The small sounds of a man making himself comfortable in his enemy's house. "You've aged. The last 10 years have not been gentle to you." "They haven't. No, I imagine not." The clink of a glass. "You know, I stood at my own funeral, Knox. Did you know that in a workman's coat at the very back behind the Miller widow? I watched them lower my box, and I watched your face, and do you know what I saw on it?" Vane's voice went soft with old pleasure. "Disappointment. You were disappointed, Knox, that I'd escaped you into death. I have treasured that expression for 10 years. It's what told me you were worth the second act. A lesser enemy I'd have left buried. But a man who's disappointed you cheated him of your revenge. That's a man worth coming back for." "Why now?" Kieran said flat. "Because 10 years is how long it takes to rebuild what the Panic of '73 took from me. I had to start over, Knox. New name, new territory, new bank. It was tedious. And the entire while through all of it, I promised myself one indulgence when I was whole again." His voice dropped, intimate, terrible. "You. This valley. The one thing I never finished. You beat Colton, and you thought you'd beaten me, and you spent 10 years the biggest man in a valley that should have been mine, and I have come back to take it. Knox acre by acre, cow by cow, and to make you watch the way you made me watch you win." A pause. "I understand there was a woman, recently. A mail-order girl the town threw away and you took in. I understand my man saw to her 3 nights past. I'm sorry for that in my way. I didn't order it specifically. I told him to break you, and he used his judgment. But I confess, I'm not sorry it worked. You look broken, Knox. You look like a man who's lost the last thing." In the dark, Annabelle felt Sarah's hand crush hers. And in the lit room, there was a silence. And into that silence, Annabelle Porter waited for the flat, cold voice to crack. Waited for the dark thing to rise in. Kieran waited, because she knew. She knew that Vane had just handed him the exact provocation that 10 years ago on the flat above the creek had sent him into the dark. A dying enemy. A gloating confession. The invitation to make it end in blood, now quiet, satisfying. She heard Kieran Knox breathe. And then she heard him say, in a voice that had no dark in it at all, a voice as clean and level and daylit as anything she'd ever heard from him. "You confess it then. The funeral. The false death. Ryland's father in the undertaking. The bank, the law, Colton, all of it. 10 years of it. You sit in my house and you confess the whole of it to my face." "Confess?" Vane laughed, warm and easy. "Knox, there's no one here but you and me and your grief. Who would I be confessing to?" "Yes, I did all of it. Every word. I bought my own funeral off old Ryland, and I raised his boy up to be my hand inside your own outfit, and I have been the ruin of this valley for 20 years wearing 2 names, and I would do every bit of it again. There. Does hearing it break you further? I do hope so. It's enough," Kieran said. Not to Vane, to the room, to the dark. "It's enough," Kieran Knox said again louder, and Annabelle heard the scrape of chairs and boots, and the county marshal rose beside her and stepped through the open door, and she heard Vane's warm voice stop as if struck. Heard it stop dead in his throat. Heard the whole world of his certainty come down at once. "Silas Vane," said the marshal, a stranger's voice, a voice from a county Vane didn't own. "You're under arrest for the murder of Pete Halloran, for cattle theft, for arson, for the attempted murder of persons on this ranch, and for a list of frauds I'll read you at leisure." There's 11 witnesses to what you just said standing in the next room in the yard, and not one of them's on your payroll because I made sure of it. And there's a real judge 2 counties over who never took your money because he never knew your name. It's over." The room erupted. Vane's 2 men going for their guns and finding the yard full of Kieran's going down without a shot fired because there were too many, and they weren't fool enough, and Vane himself. Annabelle heard it. Silas. Vane came up out of his chair with a sound she'd never forget. Not fear, worse than fear. The sound of a man watching a thing he'd been certain of dissolve in his hands. "You," he said to Kieran. "You had them here. The whole you had them here. You let me sit, and then the fury, the mask coming off at last, 10 years of cold, cracking into heat. You think a marshal from the next county saves you. You think a confession in a room saves you. I own men in every. I'll have lawyers. Knox, I'll have, it's your word, and a hired marshal against a respected man of business. There's no proof. There's a witness," Kieran said. And Annabelle Porter understood it was her name in the shape of those words, and she stepped through the door into the light. She would remember Silas Vane's face for the rest of her life. She would remember the exact moment the man who wore decency like a coat looked up and saw a dead woman walk into the room. The woman his man had shot through a window. The woman the church had told into the ground. The woman he'd not apologized for killing not 5 minutes before walk-in alive in a dead woman's gray shawl, with 4 pages of careful ledger held against her heart. She would remember how his face came apart. "You," Vane whispered. "You're but he, my man said." "Your man said wrong," Annabelle said, and her voice did not shake, and she was proud of it to the end of her days. "Your man shot out a window and put 5 rounds through an oak table and rode back to you certain because certain is what men like you require, isn't it? You require the world to be certain and settled and going the way you arranged it. You require decent men to stay ruined and dead women to stay dead and towns to toll their bells on schedule." She stepped closer, and the whole room was silent, and Silas Vane stared at her like she was risen from a grave, because in every way that mattered to him, she was. "My name is Annabelle Porter. My father was a decent man who was murdered by men exactly like you men in fine coats at fine tables, who took an honest man's whole life's savings, knowing it would kill him, and who never lost one night's sleep over it, and who are walking around Boston free as air this very minute. I couldn't touch them. I was too small, and too poor, and too thrown away to touch them. So I came west, Mr. Vane, and do you know what I found here?" Vane couldn't speak. "I found that out here." Annabelle said, "A man answers. Not always to the law. The law's a slow thing and doesn't always come. But he answers. And I found that I am not too small to be the one he answers to. I kept a ledger the night you burned the barn. 4 pages in my own hand written while it was still true. Every hour, every man, every direction your raiders came and went. It's the shape of your whole operation. Mr. Vane drawn by a shipping clerk's daughter, who has been reading ledgers for the truth since she was 9 years old. And it will hold up in front of your real judge 2 counties over the same way it held up in front of me. You didn't just fail to kill a woman. You handed a witness the one thing men like you never account for." She held up the 4 pages. "A record, kept by someone you were too certain to notice. That's how men like you always fall in the end, not to a bigger man. To the small one you didn't count. And Silas Vane, the ghost, the banker, the ruin of the valley, the man who had waited 10 years in a false grave to watch Kieran Knox brought low. Silas Vane sat back down in the chair slowly in the house of the man he'd come to break, and put his face in his hands and said nothing at all because there was nothing left to say, because a dead man's ledger had come to bury him, and it was being read aloud by a woman he'd thrown away without ever knowing her name. The marshal took him, then him and his 2 men out into the yard, where 39 of Kieran's hands stood in a silent ring. 39 men who had grieved a woman for 3 days and were about to learn she was alive. And Kieran Knox came across the room to Annabelle and stopped in front of her close and looked down at her with 10 years of weight lifting visibly off his shoulders, off his whole frame. And he didn't touch her yet. Not in front of the marshal, not in front of the men filing in at the door. You stayed clean, Annabelle said softly just for him. He handed you the dark thing on a silver plate. The same provocation 10 years later. And you didn't take it. You said it's enough to the room instead of to him. You did it right. I told you I would. Men have told me a great deal they didn't do. I know, Kieran Knox said. That's why I'm going to spend the rest of my life being the one who did. He looked at her, and the not-quite smile was there, and behind it, for the first time since a train platform 4 weeks before, there was no shadow at all. It's over, Annabelle. The ghost's caught. The land's safe. There's not one dark thing left on this ranch that needs a lie or a cellar or a witness in the dark. He glanced toward the door, toward the men, toward Sarah weeping openly, and the gray Colorado evening beyond. Which means I've got a promise to keep. In the daylight. In the calm. In front of the valley. Just as soon as I've told 39 grieving men that the woman they've been mourning is standing right here, and let every one of them see you walk back out of the grave. Behind him, Tom Avery pushed through the door and stopped dead and made a sound no one who heard it ever forgot. And then the men were crowding in, and the grief on their faces was turning to something else, something too big for the room. And Annabelle Porter stood in the light with a dead woman's shawl around her shoulders and 4 pages of truth against her heart. No longer a thing that had been returned. No longer a housekeeper. No longer a woman hidden behind stone, but the plain and undeniable center of a house that 4 weeks ago had been holding its breath, and now at last could let it go. Tom Avery got to her first, and the boy couldn't speak. He just stood in front of Annabelle with his hat crushed in both hands and his whole young face working. And then he reached out and touched her sleeve, just touched it, the way a man touches a thing, to be sure it's real. And when it was real, his knees nearly went. "We buried you," he whispered. "In our heads, ma'am, we buried you. Old Willis made you a bird." "I know he did," Annabelle said gently. "And I want that bird, Tom. I want you to give it to me anyhow. I'll keep it my whole life." That broke him, and it broke the rest of them behind him. 39 hard men crowding into a shot-up kitchen to see a ghost, and Kieran let them have it. Let them touch her sleeve and stammer and turn away to wipe their faces. And only when the worst of it had passed did he step up onto the hearth where they could all see him and raise one hand and wait for the room to go still. "I owe you the truth," Kieran Knox said. "All of you. And you're not going to like the first part of it," he told them. The whole of it standing on his own hearth, the trap, the lie. The 3 days he'd let them grieve a woman who was alive under their boots, and why. He didn't soften it, and he didn't excuse it. He told them he hadn't trusted them, and he told them why he hadn't, because Ryland had come from among them, and he'd missed it for 2 months, and he couldn't gamble Annabelle's true life on a judgment that had already failed once. And then he stood there and let them be angry the way Annabelle had told him he must, and some of them were. "You let me think she was dead," said old Willis, and his voice shook with something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief. 3 days, Kieran. I carved a bird." "You did," Kieran said. "And I took it off you and lied to your face about it, and it was the worst thing I did this whole week, worse than sitting across from Vane, and I'll carry it. You've every right to be sore, Willis. Every right. I'm not asking you not to be." "You should have trusted us," said another man. "I know it. We'd have died before we sold you. Any of us. You should have known that." "I should have," Kieran said. "And the fact that I didn't is Vane's last wound, and it's the one I'll be longest healing, because that's what a man like him does. He doesn't just take your cattle, he takes your certainty that the men beside you are the men beside you. I let him do that to me. I let him make me doubt 40 good men. That's on me, not on you, and I'm sorry for it, and I'll spend a long time earning it back." And it was the earning it back that turned them. Annabelle saw not the apology the men had heard apologies, but the plain admission that it would have to be earned and couldn't be spoken away. Old Willis looked at Kieran a long moment, and then he looked at Annabelle alive in the shawl, and something in the old man's face gave up its anger the way a fist gives up a grip. "Well," Willis said gruffly, "you're alive, ma'am. That's the main thing. A man can't stay sore in a room where a dead woman turned out alive. It ain't natural." He turned back to Kieran. But I'm keeping the bird till I decide to give it. That's my terms." "Those are fair terms," Kieran said, and the room at last breathed. They caught the rest of it in the days after the county marshal came back with 2 more from his own uncorrupted county, and they went through the Barquet's books and Vane's and Annabelle's 4 pages, became the spine of a case that grew over that autumn into something no bought lawyer could bend. Because once the valley understood Silas Vane was alive and taken, the silence broke everywhere at once. Ranchers who'd lost land to called-in notes 10 and 15 years back came forward. The Miller widow whose husband had died the winter Vane took their place for a tenth of its worth rode in from 40 miles off to testify. A whole valley that had learned to eat its grievances against a man too powerful to fight discovered all in a rush that the man was in a cell in a county he didn't own, and that a shipping clerk's daughter had put him there with a ledger, and that it was safe at last to remember out loud. Ryland they found in Denver, and he did not go quiet, and it does not matter how he went, only that he answered for Pete Halloran the way Kieran had promised at the graveside he would. And Silas Vane the ghost, the banker, the man who wore decency like a coat, stood trial before a real judge 2 counties over that winter, and there was no jury he owned, and no newspaper he'd bought, and no closed box to hide in this time. And he was convicted on the testimony of 11 witnesses, and the ledger of a woman he'd been too certain to notice. And he went to prison. An old man, and he did not come out. He'll appeal? Annabelle said the night the verdict came. Men like that always appeal. Prentice and Hale would have appealed. Let him, Kieran said. He can appeal from a cell. He can spend the last of his good coat's money on lawyers and appeals. And it won't buy him one thing because there's a record now, Annabelle. A real one. In your hand. And a record's the one thing his kind of money was never any good against. You said it to his face, and it was true. The small one you don't count. That's how they fall. He looked at her across the long kitchen table, where it had all been told the table with the buffalo gun's hole in it still, because Kieran had refused to replace it. I want to keep that table, he'd said, so I never forget how close it came. And they had kept it whole and all. Winter came down over the Barquet, and the ranch healed. The herd, what was left of it, wintered thin but alive, and in the spring, Kieran bought back double what Vane had stolen because the valley wanted to sell to the man who'd ended the ghost and would take his price over any other. The north barn rose again from its own ashes, and Tom Avery drove the first nail, and it was a better barn than the one that burned. And through all of it, all that autumn and winter, Kieran Knox did not ask Annabelle Porter the question, though the whole ranch was waiting for it, and Sarah near burst with the waiting. He's waiting for the calm. Annabelle told Sarah in the kitchen over the mending. He promised me the daylight, no shadows. He'll not ask me while there's a trial hanging and a verdict pending and a ghost who might yet appeal. He wants me to answer with my whole free mind, and he'll wait for the day there's nothing pressing on it but him. That man, Sarah said, exasperated and moved in equal measure. 30 years I've known him, and he's never once done a thing the easy way. Any other man would have asked you in the cellar with the gun still hot and been glad of the yes. He waits for the calm. She shook her head. You know that's love, child, the waiting. A man who wants a woman claimed asks in the fear when she's too shook to say no. A man who wants her chosen waits for the calm when she's free to. He's telling you what you are to him in the waiting, same as he told you on the platform in the offering of work instead of marriage. He's been telling you the whole time in the only language he's got. I know it, Annabelle said quietly. I've known it since the cellar. He asked her in the spring. He asked her on a morning when the last snow had gone off the high grass, and the trial was 3 months done, and the appeal denied, and the herd bought back, and the barn raised on a morning when there was at last not one single shadow left on the Barquet. And he did it in the open in the yard in front of God and Sarah, and 39 men, who all suddenly found reasons to be near the house that morning, because Kieran had told exactly one person his plan, and that person was Sarah Beckett, and Sarah Beckett could no more hold a joy than a sieve holds water. He didn't kneel. Annabelle was glad of it after. Kneeling wasn't him. He stood in front of her tall the gray coming in heavier at his temples than it had a year ago, the scar white under his jaw, And he took his hat off and turned it once in his hands, the way he had on the platform, the day he found her and Annabelle understood the gesture. Now the way she hadn't, then a hard man reaching for words he didn't often have call to use. "Annabelle Porter," he said. "A year ago I found you on your knees in the dirt at Silver Creek Station, refusing to take a wicked man's charity, and I told you I stopped because of my mother, because there was a debt I owed to any woman left standing on a platform with no one to speak for her. That was true. But it wasn't the whole of it. And I've never once given you the whole of it in the open in the daylight, with nothing pressing, and I mean to now." He turned the hat again. "I stopped because in 20 years of looking, I had never once seen a person who couldn't be made small, and there you were being made small by a whole town and refusing it. And I thought I have to know that person, whatever it costs. I have to know how a soul stays that size in a world built to shrink it." Behind him, Sarah was already crying. "I know now," Kieran said. "I've had a year of knowing. You stay that size because you decided to the way I decided a long while back I'd rather think too much than turn into Colton. You made yourself Annabelle out of grief and steel the same as I made myself, and I have never in my life met another person who made themselves the same way, and I don't expect I ever will again." His voice went rough. "I told you I'd court you proper in the open in front of the same town that watched you thrown away. I've done that, all winter. The whole valley's watched me court you, and the whole valley knows what you are. Now not a mail-order woman thrown away in shame, but the woman who caught Silas Vane, the woman whose ledger emptied his cell of every lie the heart of the Bar-K, and half the reason this valley's free of him. They know it. I made sure they'd know it. And now with all of them knowing, and no shadow on this land, and your whole free mind about you." He stopped turning the hat and held it still and looked at her. "I'm asking you clean in the daylight, in the calm the way I promised. Not to be my housekeeper, not to be claimed. I'm asking you to choose me. Annabelle Porter, the way I chose you a year ago before I even knew your name. Marry me. Not because you've nowhere else to go. You could go anywhere on the line, and I'd buy the ticket myself and never say a word against it. Because you'd rather stay. Because you choose it. That's the only way I'll have you, and it's the only way you'd have me, and I think we both knew it in a root cellar a long while back. And I've made you wait a whole winter for the calm, because you deserve to say it in the calm. So, here's the calm." He took a breath. "Will you have me?" Annabelle Porter looked at him. She thought about the platform, and the broken trunk, and the whole town laughing at a woman on her knees. She thought about Gerald Harrington's rejected ticket, and the men in the fine coats free as air in Boston. She thought about a big man crouching down beside her ruined trunk without being asked, and setting the bent latch home with a soft final click. She thought about Pete dying in the shack, and Colton dying on the flat, and Vane rising out of a false grave, and a buffalo gun through an oak table, and a kiss in a cellar in the lamplight. She thought about a year of dark-hour talks at a long scrubbed table, and the worst thing Kieran had ever done handed across it to her, trusting her not to run. And she thought about the truest thing she knew, which was that this man had never once in a whole year mistaken her for a thing that could be returned. "Kieran Knox," she said, and her voice was clear, and it carried across the yard the way it had carried across the platform a year before, only now it carried joy instead of defiance. "A year ago I told a train platform full of strangers that I would rather sleep in a ditch than take one more thing from a man who promised decency and delivered a ticket out of town. And every day, since you have promised me decency and delivered it. Every single day. You promised me honest work and delivered it. You promised me no man would tell me otherwise and delivered it. You promised me the daylight and the calm, and here it is. You are the only man who ever made me a promise and kept every one." Her eyes were streaming, and she didn't care, and neither did 39 men suddenly finding the sky very interesting. "So yes, I'll have you. I choose you in the calm with my whole free mind the way you chose me before I was ever free. Yes, Kieran. 1,000 times yes." And Kieran Knox, who did not smile easy, who Annabelle had watched for a whole year, ration his smiles like a man rations water in a dry country. smiled then full and wide and without one shadow on it, and dropped his hat in the dirt and crossed the space between them, and kissed her in the open yard in front of God and Sarah and every hand on the bar K, who let out a roar you could hear in the next county. They were married in Silver Creek that summer. Not quiet, not hidden. Kieran Knox would not have it quiet. He had said he'd court her in front of the same town that threw her away, and he married her in front of them too in the church, whose bell had once told her false death, and he made sure every soul who'd stood on that platform a year before and laughed was there, to watch her walk down the aisle chosen. Mrs. Thorne came. Annabel saw her in a back pew, the woman who'd wanted her run out of town. And Annabel did a thing that surprised the whole church. She stopped on her way to the altar, and she went to Mrs. Thorne, and she took the old woman's hand. "You told Kieran the town didn't need my sort," Annabel said gently, so only she could hear. "I've thought about that a great deal this year, and I've decided I'm not going to hold it against you, because holding things doesn't do to them the one thing you'd want it to do. It only weighs you. Kieran taught me that. So I'm setting it down, Mrs. Thorne, right here. And I hope you'll come to the wedding supper, because I mean to be part of this town a long, long time, and I'd rather we started clean." Mrs. Thorne, who had never in her life been forgiven a thing she'd done wrong, because she'd never in her life admitted doing one, sat in the back pew and wept into her glove, and came to the wedding supper, and was in the years after one of Annabel's fiercest friends, because there is no ally on this earth like a hard old woman who has been shown a mercy she knew she didn't earn. Gerald Harrington did not come. Gerald Harrington had sold his 40 acres that spring and gone east, unable to bear a valley in which the woman he'd thrown away had become the woman who caught Silas Vane, and no one missed him. And his name faded out of the valley, the way the names of small cowards do, while the name of the woman he'd rejected grew. They built the house that autumn. Kieran would not have them live in the old house, the one his mother had died in, the one Annabel had brought back to breathing that first week. Not because it held bad memories, but because it held old ones, and he wanted a thing that was theirs. So they built a new house on the rise above the creek, the same flat where Colton had died, and where the whole hard story had turned, and Annabel understood what he was doing, without his saying it. He was putting a home on the ground where he'd once done the worst thing he ever did, so that the ground would mean something else forever after. "A man can't unbury the past," Kieran told her the day they laid the foundation. "You taught me that. Carrying Colton doesn't undo Colton, but you can build something new on top of the ground where it happened and let the new thing be what the ground's for. That's not the same as forgetting. It's better than forgetting. It's making the ground answer for something good for once." The house rose through the fall, and it was the first thing Kieran Knox had ever built to be lived in rather than defended, and every man on the bar K worked on it, and old Willis carved a whole flock of birds for the mantel and set the first one, the one he'd whittled for a grave that never was, right in the center, and never did give it to Annabel after all, because he'd decided it belonged to the house. Their first child came the following summer, a daughter, and Kieran Knox, who had faced armed men without changing his breathing, who had sat across a table from a risen ghost without a tremor, held his daughter for the first time and wept openly in front of Sarah Beckett, who had waited 30 years to see him weep for a good reason instead of a hard one. "You know what I keep thinking," Kieran said that night, the baby asleep against his chest, Annabel beside him. "I keep thinking about the platform. If that trunk latch hadn't broke, if your things hadn't spilled, if you'd been standing there proper and dignified instead of down on your knees in the dirt, I might have walked past. I might not have seen the thing I saw. The whole of this," he looked down at the sleeping child, "turns on a broken latch." "It doesn't," Annabel said softly. "It turns on you stopping. 100 men walked past me on that platform, Kieran. The whole town walked past. You're the one who crouched down. The latch was just the latch. You were the thing that mattered." She reached over and touched the baby's cheek. "You always were." They named the daughter for Kieran's mother, and Annabel hung the gray shawl, the one from the cedar chest, the one with the note, "There is more than one way to be a mother. Keep it warm over the cradle," and it was at last the thing the elder Mrs. Knox had always meant it to be. Working, not folded. Warm. The years came on, and the valley grew, And Annabel Porter Knox grew with it, no longer a woman thrown away, no longer even only the woman who caught Silas Vane, but the woman who built the things a growing valley needed and had never had. She started the school first because she had watched Tom Avery grow into a foreman who could not read a contract, and she swore no child on the Bar K would grow up unable to read the ledgers that decided their lives, because she of all people knew what a ledger could hold and what it could hide. The school went up on Bar K land, and the valley's children came to it from 40 miles around, and Annabel taught in it herself for the first years, until the valley could hire a proper teacher. The library came after because Annabel had never forgotten selling her father's books to buy the passage west, and she had sworn on that train, watching the country go by, that if she ever had a home again, it would have books in it that no misfortune could ever make her sell. The Silver Creek Library was the first for 100 miles in any direction, and she stocked it with her own money and Kieran's, and she put her father's name on it. Thomas Porter, who had been a decent man in a place that didn't reward it, whose name a bank once took everything from now, carved over the door of a building that would outlast every bank in the territory. He'd not believe it. Annabel said the day they opened it, a shipping clerk from Boston, his name over a library at the edge of the world. He'd believe it, Kieran said. He raised the woman who built it. A man who raises a soul like yours knows what she's capable of. He just didn't live to see the shape of it. He took her hand. That's the cruelest thing about death, Sarah always says. It takes them before they get to see. But you know what I think, Annabel. I think a decent man puts a thing into the world when he raises a child right, and it goes on working long after he's gone, whether he sees it or not. Your father's still building this library. He built it the day he taught a 9-year-old girl to read a ledger for the truth. He's just not here to hold the hammer. He squeezed her hand. Same as my mother's still keeping this house warm through that shawl, though she's 20 years in the ground. The good ones don't stop working just because they stop breathing. They work through us. That's the whole point of us. The Bar K became the largest and the best-run outfit in the territory, and it was known for two things above all others: that no man who worked it ever went uneducated, and that no woman who came west alone and got thrown away ever went unhoused, because Annabel Knox had made it a standing law of the ranch that any woman left on the platform at Silver Creek Station had a place at the Bar K for as long as she needed it. No questions and no debt, 3 months honest work, and full independence after exactly the offer that had once been made to her. Over the years, dozens of them came. Some stayed on. Some took the ticket to anywhere on the line. All of them left, knowing they were not things that could be returned. Silas Vane died in prison the winter their second child was born, and the news reached the Bar K by wire, and Kieran read it and set it down and was quiet a long moment. 10 years I wanted that man dead, he said finally. On the flat with Colton, I let the dark do my wanting, because I couldn't bear that his kind walked free. And now he's dead in a cell, and I find, he searched himself honestly the way she'd taught him, I find I don't feel a thing. Not triumph, not even relief. Just tired a little for the man I was who wanted it so bad. He looked at her. You did that. You know that. The old me would have wanted to ride to that prison and spit on his grave. And now he's dead, and I'd rather stay home and hold my son. You changed the shape of what I want, Annabel. That's the deepest thing one soul can do to another, and you did it without ever once trying to. I didn't change it, Annabel said. I just stood in the doorway of the room where the better want already was and waited for you to walk into it. It was always in you, Kieran. You were just standing too near your own darkness to see it. I told you that in a cellar once. You did, he said. And you were right, same as you were right about everything, and I have spent every year since being glad past speaking that a trunk latch broke on a train platform, and a whole town walked past a woman on her knees, and I was the fool who crouched down. They grew old on the rise above the creek in the house built on the ground where the worst thing had happened in a valley that had learned from watching them, what it had refused to know before. That dignity is not a thing conferred by a fine coat, or a good name, or a proper marriage, but a thing a person carries in themselves that no town's laughter and no rich man's ledger can take away. That a soul left standing on a platform with no one to speak for, it is not thereby made small, but is only waiting for the world to catch up to what it already is. and that the difference between a hard man and a wicked one, between a decent life and a cruel one, was never in what a person suffered or what they did, but in whether. When the dark thing was handed to them on a silver plate, they set it down by hand and chose the daylight instead. Sarah Beckett lived long enough to hold both grandchildren and to see the library opened and to sit one last spring on the porch of the new house, watching Kieran teach his daughter to ride the way old Pete had once taught him, and when she passed, it was in her sleep. Easy, an old woman done with her work, and they buried her on the rise where she could see the whole valley she'd watched Kieran fight for, and Annabelle put flowers on the grave every week for the rest of her life, because Sarah Beckett had been the first person west of Boston to look at a thrown-away woman and see instead a lioness. And on an evening many years on, when the valley below the rise was full of lights that hadn't existed when Annabelle first came, a town grown up out of a dusty station schools, and the library and homes stretching where there'd been only grass, Kieran Knox and Annabelle sat together on the porch of the house they'd built, old now gray, now their children grown, and their children's children coming. And they watched the lights come on one by one across the valley they'd made. "You remember the platform," Kieran said. It wasn't a question. He said it most evenings now, the way old people return to the ground their whole lives grew from. "I remember the platform. You remember what that town called you." "A mail-order woman with no value," Annabelle said, "thrown away in shame. I remember every word. I'll never forget one of them." "And you know what they call you now?" "I know what they call me now. They called her the Heart of Silver Creek. They had for years. The woman who caught the ghost, who built the school, who put her father's name over the library, who never once turned away. Another woman left standing on a platform. The valley that had laughed at her on her knees now taught its daughters her name and told them, be like her. When the world throws you away, refuse it. Stay your own size. Keep your own ledger. Choose when the calm comes, the thing that chose you first." Kieran Knox reached over in the gathering dark and took his wife's hand, old and worn and strong, and held it the way he'd held it in a root cellar half a lifetime before, and the way he'd held it across a long scrubbed table with the worst thing he'd ever done laid out between them, and the way he'd held it in a churchyard and a courtroom and a delivery room and every place a life is made. "They threw you away," Kieran Knox said, quiet and certain the oldest truth he owned. "And I chose you before you ever left town, before I knew your name, before you were ever free. And every single day since choosing you has been the finest thing I ever did with a life that had a great many hard things in it. And I would live all the hard things twice over Colton and the war and Vane and every dark night of them. If the only way to the porch of this house and the light of this valley and the warmth of your hand in mine ran straight back through a broken trunk latch on a dusty platform where a whole town walked past a woman on her knees, and one man stopped. The lights of Silver Creek burned steady in the valley below, a whole world built by two people the world had once discarded. And the woman they had called a mail-order bride, rejected in shame, had become past all argument, and for all time the heart of everything the valley was chosen and choosing, and never once from that day to the last a thing that could be returned.